Hi everyone, thank you for coming to the graduate portion of the event. So today we'll be split into two panels. So I'm hoping that we'll have a short break at around 10:20 for about 10 minutes and then resume again at 10:30 and then finish by 12:30 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. So we'll be starting with Joseph Warren and his paper Hobbes and Coordination. So Joseph is a political science PhD candidate at UC Berkeley, and whose research focuses on American political development and game theory. So yeah, thank you for joining us, Joseph. I'll now hand over to you.
Okay, thank you, Holly, for the introduction, and thank you everyone for listening to me talk about my paper for a bit. So my paper concerns the role of coordination among citizens and Hobbes' argument for an absolute sovereign. And I'm not completely sure that it all holds together, so hopefully you can trace it out and let me know how whether things make sense or not. So first, I will discuss Hobbes' regress argument for sovereignty, and then I will discuss a contemporary response to Hobbes' argument. And third, I will then relate this discussion to recent ideas about coordination. And fourth, I will then, time permitting, return to Hobbes to assess how ideas about coordination affect Hobbes' argument for absolute sovereignty. So to begin, Hobbes argued that government can only be based on the rule of human will, not the rule of law, because of our human propensity for disagreement and the consequent necessity for some agent to interpret the law. As Gene Hampton shows, Hobbes' argument for the necessity of will-based government is an argument from an infinite regress, to quote Hobbes, and whosoever thinking sovereign power too great will seek to make it less, must subject himself to the power that can limit it, that is to say, to a greater, end quotes. So this regress argument aims to show that any attempt to constrain sovereign power through a rule must fail because it requires some higher level sovereign power to enforce the rule. Rules alone cannot achieve this because, in Hobbes' words, all laws have need of interpretation. And consequently, if there's only a rule without a sovereign to interpret it, then when individuals disagree about the rule, there is, to quote again, no judge to decide the controversy. It returns therefore to the sword, end quotes. In other words, a procedure dividing powers among different actors is impossible because human beings are subject to a diversity of opinions. If a rule purports to limit political actors in the absence of a sovereign, then there's no mechanism to resolve these conflicts over whether or not those actors violated the rule. Because rules are limited in this way, rules cannot resolve all political conflicts. Hobbes concludes that rules are insufficient. They require interpretation, which requires a human will, either an individual or collective agents. And there must be, as Hampton describes, a single source of power, which is authorized to decide any question, resolve any disputes, which of course is the sovereign. And so second, a contemporary response to Hobbes' regress argument for sovereignty is provided by James Harrington. Harrington sought to defend the conceptual possibility of an empire of laws and not of men. Essentially, Harrington argues that institutional procedures can align public and private interests, which is, of course, a very common idea among contemporary game theorists. And so to show the possibility of such procedures, Harrington provides the example of two schoolgirls dividing a cake. And so here I'm going to quote from Harrington. For example, two of them have a cake yet undivided, which was given between them, that each of them therefore may have that which is due. Divide, says one unto the other, and I will choose, or let me divide, and you shall choose. If this be once agreed upon, it is enough, for the dividend dividing unequally loses, in regard that the other takes the better half. Wherefore she divides equally, and so both have rights. So this is the example that Harrington used to show how an institutional procedure can imply self-interested actions on the part of either girl, resulting in a fair division of the cake. Since both girls mutually constrain each other, neither is unconstrained by law, and therefore, Harrington concludes, there's no need for an absolute sovereign. Of course, not all were convinced by Harrington's example, and in response to Harrington, Matthew Wren argued that Harrington neglects a crucial aspect of the scenario. Why should the girls adhere to the procedure? Either, Wren argues, the schoolmistress enforces the procedure, or in Wren's words, the stronger of the two girls would have eaten up the whole cake. So as far as I can tell, Harrington doesn't have a strong response to this critique. But in thinking about the example of the schoolgirls, neither Harrington nor Wren considers those who presumably fill up most of the room, that is, most of the class. Harrington and Wren's inattention to the audience of the two girls dividing the cake distinguishes Harrington and Wren from contemporary political scientists who think about the enforcement of procedural rules through coordination among a large number of individual actors. And so in the third step, the argument, I'm going to zoom forward 300 or so years. So consider the idea of coordination around focal points, what the Nobel laureate Roger Myerson describes as one of the great fundamental ideas of social philosophy. And Myerson traces the contemporary version of the idea of focal points back to Thomas Schelling. Thomas Schelling wasn't really himself a game theorist, more of a critic of game theory, but he drew upon game theory and thought about simple examples, much like Harrington was thinking about in the context of the Cold War. And so he describes the idea of coordination around focal points in his 1960 book on Cold War strategy. To introduce the idea of focal points, Schelling uses simple examples, such as a couple separated in a department store or two parachuters landing in unknown territory. So from the perspective of a game theorist, any location for the two individuals to meet is an equilibrium. If both individuals are to meet at some arbitrary location, then neither has an incentive to go elsewhere. Yet, this obviously doesn't solve the problem from the perspective of the couple in the department store or the parachuters. With no way to communicate, each must guess about what the other will do. And it's actually even more complicated than that, the way Schelling describes it. To quote from Schelling, one does not simply predict where the other will go, since the other will go where he predicts the first to go, which is wherever the first predicts the second to predict the first to go, and so on ad infinitum. So to solve this problem, as Schelling argues, individuals use focal points. The couple in the department store might meet at the checkout stands, while the parachuters might meet at a prominent bridge. These so-called obvious markers function as signals to coordinate expectations among individuals, so each individual can predict what the other will predict that they will predict the other, and so on ad infinitum will do. To relate the idea of focal points to political authority, Roger Myerson uses a Schelling type example. So here I'll quote from Myerson. Consider an example of a group of players, all wearing name tags, are sitting in a circle. Each must independently write one player's name on a piece of paper. If they all write the same name, then they each get $100, except that the person named gets $200. Otherwise, they all get $0. The players have never met each other before, but just before they play, someone walks in, puts a big shiny crown on one player's head, and walks away. Everyone can see the person with the crown and can read the name tag, end quote. So in this scenario, the introduction of the crown does not affect any player's payoffs or possible actions. Nonetheless, the crown very plausibly affects the outcome of the game because it affects players' expectations about what every other player expects everyone else to do. We might extend this idea to understand how purely formal rules such as divide and I will choose can constrain political actors. Returning to Harrington's example of the two schoolgirls, perhaps a procedure such as divide and I will choose provides a focal point for coordination by the rest of the class. If either girl violates the procedure, such as the bigger girl attempting to steal the whole cake, then everyone else in the class knows to intervene to support the smaller girl. If the rest of the class is ready to gang up on the girl who tries to steal the whole cake, then that plausibly deters either girl from attempting to steal the cake in the first place. If this is possible, then it seems that procedures can be enforced without a supreme authority. And it ends Hobbes's infinite regress argument for an absolute sovereign. So the most direct means for Hobbes to reply to this line of reasoning would be to deny the capacity of individuals to coordinate around focal points. But Hobbes cannot take this route, because for Hobbes, despite a diversity of opinions, individuals must have sufficient capacity to coordinate for everyone to obey the sovereign. As Gene Hampton points out, this rule of recognition of the sovereign is itself a type of procedure, and hence Hobbes must accept that individuals can coordinate around at least some types of procedures. And so if a line can be drawn exactly between, on one hand, the procedures required for coordination around a potential sovereign, and on the other, procedures required for coordination to constrain a potential sovereign, then Hobbes's argument survives. But if the procedures that Hobbes requires imply a sufficiently high threshold on individuals' capacity for coordination, then we might as well imagine individuals coordinating around procedures to constrain government officials with no need for an unconstrained sovereign to interpret laws at all. And so, as a final step in the argument, consider an example of a procedure that Hobbes allows that might require a relatively high threshold on individuals' capacity for coordination. And here I turn to Hobbes's discussion of succession in monarchies. Hobbes acknowledges that succession in monarchies can be a challenge and devotes a fair amount of space to addressing it. To quote from Leviathan, "The greatest difficulty about the right of succession, as in monarchy, and the difficulty arises from this, that at first sight it is not manifest who is to appoint the successor, nor many times who it is whom he hath appointed. For in both these cases, there is required a more exact ratiocination than every man is accustomed to use." End quotes. The difficulty introduced by monarchical succession for Hobbes is exactly the problem of how to coordinate expectations around a new sovereign. And in answering this problem of how to coordinate expectations, Hobbes provides several possible solutions. And the first two of Hobbes's possible solutions are most important. First, in order to identify the successor, Hobbes looks to verbal directions by the prior monarch, quotes, "his express words and testaments, or by other signs sufficient," end quotes. In other words, Hobbes accepts that it is possible for all individuals to agree on verbal or written instructions from the prior monarch. Second, in the absence of verbal or written instructions, an individual must look to, in Hobbes's words, other natural signs of the will, whereof the one is custom, end quotes. Therefore, Hobbes not only accepts that it is possible for all individuals to agree on written instructions, but also that individuals can coordinate on sufficiently precise customary procedures. And so these are the steps in the argument as I've laid them out in the paper. And from here, I'm not exactly sure how I would bring the argument together. One thought is to think about this as an empirical question. Empirically, what are the possible capacities for individuals to coordinate? And here what one might do is look at political science research on protests in response to evidence of election fraud or coordination in international law to think through where does it seem that individuals' capacity for coordination really are, and where in the spectrum of procedural complexity might we try to draw this line where some procedures are acceptable and consistent with Hobbes' argument versus procedures that people can coordinate around that are inconsistent. However, in thinking about this, it's not exactly clear what, to me at least, what exactly the empirical question is. Because if you ask any political scientist about protests around elections, they would say, well, of course, people are coordinating. But following an argument such as that of Richard Tuck on popular sovereignty, one might think that people are operating as a single agent and thereby enforcing procedures in the same sense that Wren argues the schoolmistress would enforce the procedure of "I will divide and you shall choose." And so that's where I'm left at this argument. Thank you all for listening, and I look forward to any questions or comments or critiques that you may have.
Every time. Okay, yeah, thank you for that. That was really interesting. So now we'll be moving on to Peter Thomas, presenting the paper "The Infant Cry of the Mortal God, Fiction, Figure and Fancy in Hobbes' Leviathan, 1651. And Peter is a history PhD student at UCLA who studies the history of political thought, in particular the intersections of political thought with the faculties of rhetoric and aesthetics, science and theology in the early modern period. So thank you, Peter. I'll now pass on to you.
Okay, thank you. And I should just say that I apologize if anyone this paper was circulated in advance, and if anyone read it, I've kind of made some changes and cut it in places to try to keep to the time. And I've also, this paper does cover a lot of ground that's been part of the conference over the past few days. So I'll be moving rather quickly, if at all, over a lot of the very important Hobbes scholarship, which means that it may sound as if I feel what I'm saying is very novel. I don't. Again, I'm just leaving those references to the side, mostly because they've been covered, or even more embarrassingly, because some of the people who have written that work have been or are in attendance anyway. This paper seeks to bring together, perhaps, great emphasis on perhaps, closer than has been attempted hitherto, two elements of Hobbes' thinking about representation: his political ontology and his theory of language. In her classic, if also contested, The Concept of Representation, Hannah Fenichel-Pitkin argues that representation was, in Leviathan, quote, a discovery for Hobbes, which fitted into the structure of a difficult political philosophical argument he had formulated twice before, and it seemed to him to enhance and strengthen that structure. While several of Pitkin's claims about Hobbes's theory of representation, especially that its, quote, context is one of political rather than, say, aesthetic thought, have been rightly and repeatedly criticized, some consensus endures that representation sophisticates Hobbes' political thought by solving several of its conceptual problems. But although it seems beyond dispute that the theory of representation enriches Hobbes' argument in Leviathan, it is less clear if it does so exclusively by enhancing its structure or resolving its tensions. I want to argue that it does not, in fact, do this, and moreover, that it introduces new tensions that do not fatally compromise, but do complicate that argument. To this end, then, I suggest that there is an asymmetry in the political geometry of Leviathan, which the concept of representation is responsible for both creating and, if it be admitted possible, resolving. On the one hand, Hobbes argues that the sovereign represents the unity of the multitude as commonwealth. On the other, the prerequisite of that unity and its personhood is the representation of the multitude by the sovereign. How the sovereign can both make and represent what Hobbes insists is the, quote, real unity of the multitude is a vexing and vital question. However, it is not a question that is begged by Hobbes's political theory alone. His theory of language is also fixated on a system of representation that has generative and constitutive power. Indeed, it is this very system, language itself, that engenders the Commonwealth by actualizing the representative relations that comprise it. I'm going to argue that the person of the state in Hobbes must be understood as not only a political and legal, but also as a poetic, linguistic, and rhetorical figure, as a fiction born out of and born by language. And this argument obviously encroaches on several important areas of Hobbes' scholarship. The scholars whom I seem to follow most closely are those such as Johannes Evrigenus, Victoria Kahn, and Philip Pettit, who argue specifically that Hobbes worked on, and we might affirm with Hans Blumenberg, therefore with, the instabilities of language as he understood them in order to formulate his civil science and articulate his theory of the Commonwealth. And so I'm going to explore that theory of language in the first part of the paper, and then I'm going to turn to the results for the Commonwealth and the problem of political representation in the second. My conclusion is really that the poiesis of Leviathan, the Commonwealth, emerges from the poesy of Leviathan, the text. In order for the former to be made, the latter must in turn make its readers into subjects capable of both imagining their unity and willing that unity to be personated by the sovereign. Now, Hobbes's political theory has often been understood as a departure from, if not an attack upon, the concept of representation as mimesis. And Quentin Skinner has argued that its, quote, fundamental insight is that the act of representation is a matter not of producing images or likenesses, but simply of speaking and acting in the name of others. This is an ultimately Ciceronian account of at least political representation as personation, and Hobbes presents it first in chapter 16 of Leviathan. But much earlier in the introduction, he also offers a role to mimesis in the drama of his civil science. Quote, nature, the art whereby God hath made and governs the world, is by the art of man, as in many other things, so in this also imitated, that it can make an artificial animal. Now, Aristotle had put it down in his Physics that art imitates nature, and again in the Poetics that the art of poetry in general and its species and their respective capacities are all viewed as a whole modes of imitation. He calls these mimesides. I'm not very good at Greek. By these statements, Aristotle meant much less that art mimics nature by copying, or for that matter, representing it, than that art is a species of poiesis, or making, that constitutes an ordered process oriented toward an end, or telos, isomorphic with the process by which nature acts toward the perfection of its condition. Now, Hobbes is obviously not to be taken as arguing from Aristotelian premises. His political theory rejects the entelechy by which Aristotle had presumed that mimesis mediated a purposive progression of part to whole and established a necessary symmetry between art and nature. For Hobbes, art and nature are linked contingently, not teleologically, but it remains that the art of man is an art, and it's alike to nature insofar as this latter is also an art. And that, as Hobbes says again in the introduction, quote, the pacts and covenants by which parts of this body politique were at first made, set together and united, resemble that fiat, or let us make man, pronounced by God in the creation. The poiesis of Leviathan resembles the genesis of creation, not least for the fact that both Commonwealth and Cosmos are, to borrow from Philip Pettit, made with words. But as we know, words make for a plastic form of art and therefore a tenuous basis for Hobbes's civil science. For while there are some signs, quote, such as cannot easily be counterfeited as actions and gestures, especially if they be sudden, others there are that may be counterfeited, and these are words or speech. Yet, at the same time, it is only, quote, by the advantage of names that we are capable of science. And names, Hobbes explains in Leviathan, are, quote, those words whereby men register their thoughts, recall them when they are past, and also declare them one to another for mutual utility and conversation. Language is obviously the basis of both science and sociability, and to be sure, the civil state that alone permits them. The mutual utility of words consists in their epistemic as ergetic power, and that word ergetic I borrow from Amos Funkenstein, that is, their power to construct philosophical problems and constitute actions, including the problems and actions that produce the Commonwealth. And Hobbes avers this throughout his corpus. For instance, in De Corpore, he says that, quote, the end of knowledge is power, and the use of theorems is for the construction of problems. And lastly, the scope of all speculation is the performing of some action or thing to be done. Now, the quality of language that Hobbes thinks is capable of generating knowledge, Hobbes names perspicuity, and it is perspicuous language that operates mimetically. As, quote, the first use of language is the expression of our conceptions, that is, the begetting in another, the same conceptions that we have in ourselves. And this is called teaching. Now, to be sure, at this point, the mimetic capacity of language is not that of words to resemble things. Words don't resemble things at all for Hobbes. They resemble the notions of things impressed on our minds by sense and experience. Words are arbitrarily assigned to these by a process that Hobbes calls, quote, transference. But it is also the case that Hobbes designates the activity of teaching as the first use of language, and that he evaluates this activity by the extent to which the language in which teaching consists, begets, quote, in another, the same conception that we have in ourselves, and reproduces, quote, like knowledge in an interlocutor. This turns us toward the pedagogical and indeed rhetorical functions of Leviathan, and that is to be drawn into an ongoing debate among scholars about the relative importance of rhetoric to Hobbes. And here's where I skip a great deal and move on to say that despite all of the very generative conversation about rhetoric, the problem remains of the purpose and extent of any alleged concessions Hobbes's philosophy makes to rhetoric, or to language, and many scholars are at one in treating Hobbes's rhetoric as an ancillary function of his philosophy, as its amanuensis rather than its architect, as its form distinct from its content. And their concern is mainly with Hobbes's systematic reliance on the techniques of Ornatus, that's Quentin Skinner, his stylistic and ornamentation and illustrative similes, that's Timothy Rayler, names, of course, we're all familiar with if we weren't already before. And generally, it's Hobbes's use of language is seen to facilitate rather than fabricate his philosophical demonstrations. But I don't mean fabricate here pejoratively, but rather as a cognate with the Latin facere, to make. Hobbes's rhetoric is not just elocutionary, it is illocutionary, intended to exert not only persuasive and pedagogical, but also poetic force on its reader. And some of that poetic force is exerted in what language I would like to call poetic. Now, Hobbes thought that his work might be, quote, profitably printed and profitably taught in the universities, and maintained that his political science was as much practice as theory. And so what Hobbes is trying to do with his rhetoric is not only develop a system, but also impose that system on the world. Against the humanist notion of practical reason as a form of prudence, Hobbes tends to substitute instrumental or technical definitions of language that consider language that to be that which produces both effects and the knowledge of causes. He aspires to establish both in and through the language of Leviathan a species of didactic mimesis that is demonstrative and apodictic rather than merely deliberative or persuasive. Nosce te ipsum, read thyself, he urges in the introduction, and comments that this saying is, quote, not of late understood, clarifying it in his own, quite perspicuous, words. Ultimately, the legibility of Leviathan must suffice for the potential indeterminacy of language, conceived as a conventional system of signs, arbitrarily constituted and combined. But language can only produce an approximation of truth. For Hobbes, words, however perspicuous, do not in of themselves ensure certainty, nor does the fact that they are needful render them intrinsically truthful. The mimesis of language can itself be nothing more than a species of metaphor, and it's only Hobbes' insistence, his definition of metaphors as distinct from words proper, that holds the two apart. It is somewhat of a paradox, then, that Hobbes' civil philosophy is, like its scientific model geometry, quote, demonstrable because we make the commonwealth ourselves. For we make the commonwealth with our words, and Hobbes demonstrates it with his, but words are prone to equivocation in virtue of their essentially metaphorical character. The representationality of language that subtends Hobbes' metaphorical civil science supervenes in Leviathan at precisely that point where he seeks to displace one concept of representation, as mimesis in the narrow sense, with another, his as personation or authorization. This point at the juncture of chapters 16 and 17 is one where Hobbes subjects representation to a kind of redefinition, or better, reinvention. And Hobbes is himself at this point exercising language to achieve mutually constitutive rhetorical and logical ends. As he models with the example of faith in his definition of equivocation in the elements, so Hobbes conducts with representation an act of linguistic remaking that is operationally indistinguishable from metaphor. Hobbes' preferred notion of representation as personation preponderates no further than to the extent that he can both demonstrate its logical coherence and persuade his reader to adopt it. If representation is the fulcrum of Hobbes' political theory, it is also exemplary of his theory of political science. It is effectual only insofar as it is both rational and rhetorical. Now, many scholars have observed that representation is among the conceptual novelties of Leviathan. And here Hobbes, of course, makes two famous claims about representation in chapter 16, quote, a multitude of men are made one person when they are by one man or one person represented. And on this analysis, essentially when many persons authorize one person to bear their many persons, those many persons become one person. However, while the many persons and the person whom they authorize are in this formula discrete variables, the identity of the person whom the multitude become is elusive. and the representational asymmetry between multitude and sovereign introduced in chapter 16 is further complicated in chapter 17 when that person is given a name, the Commonwealth. In so naming it and defining it as a person, Hobbes confers upon it ontological autonomy by constituting it as a linguistic expression. Leviathan is made, quote, made with words, again to borrow from Pettit, not only because it is generated out of the covenants of the multitude, but also because it is isolable only in language. It is, in fact, because the Commonwealth comprises a set of linguistic relationships between its members, that it is not a substantive or hypostatic thing, but a multiplex conception to which has been assigned a name, Commonwealth, civitas, Leviathan, and which is only conceivable as the object of Hobbes's civil science in virtue of this naming. The personality of the state is fictional in the sense that it is artifactual, that it has been feigned, fashioned, or formed through its fabrication in language. The word Leviathan on the page of Leviathan, the text, represents by bringing into being the real unity of the multitude. And to this extent, Hobbes is insisting that the person of the Commonwealth is implicated within the representative person its representative person, who is the sovereign, and only obtains its unity when the latter acts in the capacity of the former, again, the Commonwealth. Because the fiction of the Commonwealth as a unity can be verbalized, that unity is real. Now, the identity between representer and represented, between the fictional and the real, the name and the conception to which it belongs, is of course related to the theatrical definition of representation and the theatrical provenance of the concept of representation as personation that Hobbes borrows in Leviathan. Yet, while the foregoing reasoning may sufficiently coerce compliance to the belief that sovereign and commonwealth constitute a peculiarly dyadic unity, it relies upon a complex and multi-aspected series of representations that may occlude more than they clarify, not just that the unity of the multitude emerges from the political covenant, but how this emergence can be understood or seen to take place. And it's at this crucial moment that Hobbes introduces the Leviathan as the mortal god. And he says that the only way, quote, the only way to erect such a common power as may be able to defend them, the plural members of the multitude, from the invasion of foreigners and injuries of one another's, quote, is to confer all their power and strength upon one man or upon one assembly of men, that they may reduce all their wills by plurality of voices unto one will. He then presents the covenant as essentially subjunctive and conditional, quote, this is, saying that this person, the Commonwealth, will be, quote, made by covenant of every man with every man in such manner as if every man should say to every man, the covenant follows. And this, Hobbes says, is the generation of that great Leviathan, or rather, to speak more reverently, of that mortal God to which we owe, under the immortal God, our peace and defense. And so here is the birth of the mortal God, a staggering metaphor that constitutes an appeal far beyond philosophical demonstration, and that is itself predicated upon a fiction, on the subjunctive assumption that the multitude would covenant as if to alienate themselves to the sovereign and enact their unity. In order that the as if might become an is, the plural multitude must make themselves one. They must imagine themselves as a unity and their representative person as not merely a legal, but also a poetic or poetic fiction, a mortal God. That God, however, is then a fiction that makes itself. Its infant cry is its own annunciation that corresponds to its enunciation, not only by Hobbes, but by his reader in finally yielding consent to Leviathan. Now I yield all the extra time I've taken. My apologies.
That's okay. That was really interesting. Thank you for that. Yeah, really, really interesting. Yeah, so next we have our discussant for this panel, which is Owen Phillips. And Owen Phillips is a political science graduate student at Yale, and his dissertation is on the causes of violence in the state of nature in Hobbesian political theory. So I'll now pass on to Owen.
Great. So many thanks to the organizers of this conference, and not only for bringing together all these fascinating papers, but also allowing me to join this rich conversation quite late in the day, literally, last week. I suppose that's one good feature of Zoom conferences, is that the door is kept wide open for Johnny-come-latelys. So today I have the pleasure of commenting on the intriguing papers that Joseph Warren and Peter Thomas have presented. There's so much to ponder in your argument, so I'm going to have to restrain myself and focus my attention on two elements. First, what I see is the common thread running through these papers, and second, some challenges I think each paper confronts. So I start with the common thread. It seems to me both Joseph and Peter have elucidated different parts of Hobbes's account of the establishment of the sovereign. That is, Hobbes's account of how that institution is created and maintained. So on the one hand, Joseph has shown how the concept of a coordination game is useful for making sense of Hobbes's arguments about obedience to the sovereign and further sovereign succession. But Joseph also makes clear that this concept helps us see a potential vulnerability in those arguments, namely that Hobbes must suppose some capacity for coordination on the part of citizens. And because he must suppose this, those arguments are vulnerable to the charge that one can generate Hobbesian social order without a Hobbesian enforcer of agreements, since, roughly speaking, I take it, coordination achieves the effects of such an enforcer. As Joseph puts it, quote, "The more difficult it is to recognize the sovereign, the greater the capacity for coordination that Hobbes must accept," end quote. On the other hand, Peter has made the case that we cannot understand Hobbes' account of the creation of the sovereign as well as the state without attending to his claims regarding what one can do with language or what language enables us to do. Crudely put, Peter's argument is that for Hobbes, it is only through language that individuals can become and understand themselves as members of a commonwealth, and further, that the commonwealth cannot exist without language. This means that the story of how one gets from the Hobbesian state of nature to his civil state is one that necessarily involves an explanation of our linguistic faculty and its capabilities. But this also means that the primary object of analysis of Hobbesian political science is an essentially, and therefore irreducibly, linguistic phenomenon. In Peter's very helpful formulation, the Commonwealth is, quote, "isolable only in language," end quote. Moreover, I think Peter suggests, that thought is thinkable only in virtue of the concepts Hobbes articulates in Leviathan. The text makes us see an artifact of language and proposes tools for examining its properties. We might say Leviathan creates its own explanandum. That, I take it, goes beyond recent explications of the importance of Hobbes's philosophy of language for his political theory, in particular Philip Pettit's Made with Words. So in these two papers, I think we have a vivid illustration of the exciting challenge that is the analysis of Hobbes's arguments. One must keep in view an enormous range of considerations in order to make sense of the claims that constitute Hobbes's corpus. Now, speaking of challenges, let me now turn to what I see as difficulties that Joseph and Peter face in defending their arguments. It seems to me, Joseph, that you have to say a little more about the particular mechanisms of Hobbesian social order that you think coordination could replace. In your paper, you focus on coordination with respect to recognizing some agent or agents as the sovereign, but I think you could spell that out in terms of distinct phenomena. In particular, it seems we can distinguish coordination on who the sovereign is, according to selecting a person from the set of candidate sovereigns, from coordination on whether to obey the sovereign. A related difficulty, it seems to me, is that coordination isn't sufficient to maintain obedience to the sovereign, because going against the coordination equilibrium in this case isn't necessarily more costly than going with the equilibrium, that's to say, obeying the sovereign. Indeed, I'd suggest disobeying the Hobbesian sovereign isn't intrinsically costly. So let me take a moment to spell out what I mean. In the kind of classic coordination game that is picking which side of the road to drive on, going against the equilibrium others are coordinating on is costly. It's likely one will crash into oncoming cars. But no player in the game has to punish non-coordinators in order to make this so. No one has to punish people driving on the wrong side of the road in order to make driving on the wrong side of the road costly, in order to disincentivize driving on the wrong side. Not going with the flow, we might say, is costly in itself, a sort of automatic punishment. But it's not clear to me that this obtains in the game of whether to obey the Hobbesian sovereign. Doesn't this game require that at least one player punish non-coordinators? And doesn't that require that for that player, carrying out a punishment is less costly than not carrying it out? If so, then don't we face here a collective action problem? But perhaps I've misunderstood your arguments here. I look forward to hearing your reply on that front. Now, with respect to your paper, Peter, I have this comment. It seems that you have to say more to justify your claim or suggestion that for Hobbes, words are essentially metaphorical. Here, I think there are two challenges to meet. One is to make sense of the thought, independently of whatever Hobbes is contending, that metaphoricality is the essence of words, or language more broadly. Isn't this just one feature of words rather than their essence, or just one thing we can do with words, speak metaphorically? Further, aren't metaphors intelligible only against a background of locutions that are not themselves metaphors, that are literal in their significance? Now, I suppose you may reply that these could be reasonable criticisms of this view, but nevertheless hold that that view is indeed the one Hobbes defends, despite these criticisms. But that takes me to the second challenge, namely, to show how this metaphorical or figurative or poetic conception of words is in accord with the rest of Hobbes's philosophical system. So for example, how might you synthesize Hobbes's philosophy of language as you construe it with Hobbes's corpuscularian physics? It seems that in a, say, quasi-computational reading of that philosophy of language, a reading according to which words and their grammatical relations simulate objects in their motion, it would be quite easy to draw together these different Hobbesian elements to synthesize the philosophy of language with the philosophy of physics. But how would you do that, having in hand your metaphor first reading of Hobbes's claims about words? Here I again wonder whether I'm guilty of misinterpretation, so I look forward to hearing your response. But let me say now to both of you that even if I have misunderstood you, that misunderstanding has been delightful and is a testament to the richness of your papers. A sign of a good paper is that even misreadings of it are productive. I suppose one could say something quite similar about Hobbes's own philosophy. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Owen, for those thoughtful comments, and also for volunteering your time as a discussant and quite short notice. I appreciate it. Yeah, so we'll move now onto the Q&A until 10:20. And we'll follow the same format as on the previous days of the conference. So either a Zoom hand up or a comment in the chat, and I can read that out for you. Yeah, so Jane Lewis.
Those are two really fabulous talks, and I have to say also a really phenomenal response. That was a model panel in every way, and I thought all three sat so beautifully together. My question is about language and the extent to which both game theory, the theory of coordination, and also obviously the theory of representation that Peter is drawing on, are linguistically embedded, even though there are visions of metaphor, metaphors of vision operating in both of your accounts. So my question is a really, really simple one, and it has to do with the frontispiece of Leviathan just in Joseph's terms as a focal point, in Peter's terms as something which might be doing things differently from what language is doing. And I would just like to hear both of you speculate. And actually, Owen, I'd invite you to as well. Your work sounds really fascinating. But to speculate a little bit on why, given the models that you set up in your talks, it was so important for Hobbes to so laboriously design that frontispiece, make it the first thing that his readers saw when they opened his book, how that comports with the other dynamics that you see going on in the text. And I'm even thinking of it as potentially a form of violence. Again, Owen, from that point of view. And obviously I'm thinking back to both of the talks yesterday morning by Vicky and Tracy Strong. So that's my question. Why do we need the frontispiece? And it's for both of you, or maybe even all three. Thank you very much. That was wonderful.
Well, I guess I'll start in part because I don't feel like I have a lot to contribute to answering that question. I mean, if you're thinking about it in terms of coordinating around the sovereign, then like in the example that Meyerson used of the Schelling type scenario, it's important to have something that's everyone takes to be really obvious. And this is what I take Hobbes to be getting at in the passage that Peter quoted from, which I think is a really nice illustration of how everyone needs to identify this man or this assembly in order to obey a particular individual or collective individual. And so if there's an image of what you have in mind, that's really helpful in everyone coordinating their expectations. That's just my kind of off the cuff response.
I guess I will say something as well. I think that point from Joseph is very correct and is similar to what I will say if in more convoluted terms. I will say it in more convoluted terms. I think for, at least as it relates to my argument, I do believe that for Hobbes, obviously the fiction of Leviathan, the fiction of the Commonwealth is not something that can be said to exist in any conventional sense of the word. And yet that is, of course, very difficult, both philosophically and also rhetorically, because it is difficult to make sense of something that doesn't exist. It's also difficult to convince people to yield to something that doesn't exist. And so I think Hobbes it's necessary for Hobbes to have these loci, or indeed focal points. I think that's a very interesting concept, where he can basically say, someone could say, well, where is the Leviathan? It's a fiction, you know, where is it? And Hobbes needs somewhere to point, something you can point to. And in my paper, I emphasize the word Leviathan, where that appears, the word or the mortal god, and then that word will create then images in the mind that will conduct various purposes. But I think obviously the other place that Hobbes perhaps could point to, and perhaps even, and this of course does come, I think, at least in part, his belief in the power of the frontispiece does come, as many have argued, including Quentin Skinner, from his background in humanism, classical humanism, and Quintilian and Cicero, both Quintilian especially, speak about the kind of the power of images and the ideal of certain rhetorical tropes and devices to paint a picture with words, and to have an imagistic function. But I think, to make the point, that for Hobbes, another place that one could point to and say, this is where the Leviathan exists, is that frontispiece. And I do think in some ways, that's in some ways an even easier way than to work through his philosophy of language, if that's what we presume that to be somewhat necessary to grasp his political theory. So I think that the frontispiece can serve a similar purpose in representing in that way the Commonwealth. And it does of course take the form. Well, I mean, the frontispiece is also kind of just summarizes the entire argument of Leviathan. But if we think about, obviously, the most kind of jarring and commanding image is that of the sovereign and the Leviathan. You know, is it the sovereign? Is it the Leviathan? Is it both? But that is a very bizarre and kind of almost unnatural, very artificial image, looking with all these people who kind of come together. And there's also an earlier version of the frontispiece where people aren't looking up, they're looking out. But that would just be, I talked for too long over
Well, if I may, I might just, that prompted into this thought in response to that question, which was, you said, Peter, that if somebody asks the question, well, where is the Leviathan? And it's like, well, there isn't something they can point to, a thing in the world, right? It reminded me of, the Gilbert Ryle example of showing someone around Oxford and showing the colleges, and the person says, like, oh, you showed me the colleges, but where's the university? And that's sort of it's a category error. It's like, it's not like there's a building, there it is, right? So there, similarly with the frontispiece, I think, the two things arresting about it, of course, okay, face one person's head at the top of the body, but then all of these other bodies, all these individual people constituting the body. So in response to the question, well, where's Leviathan? There would be a sense in which you're like, well, I can't point to it in the world. It's a thing that, it's a way of looking at ourselves, which I think dovetails with your argument very nicely about it's something that can only exist in speech. It's a concept, it's a way of understanding our relationships to one another, but there's no physical thing I could put, even the sovereign. I couldn't say, somebody said, oh, so Charles II, that's the sovereign, like the guy there wearing the crown. You're like, or that's Leviathan. Like, no, that's a different thing. And that exists as a more complex relation. So I wonder if, yeah, the frontispiece sort of gets at trying to represent visually this idea that it would be a category error to think that there's a physical thing in the world, a natural person we could point to and say, that's Leviathan. Maybe, I don't know. But again, like I said, just kind of riffing on things you've already said, Peter.
That's really interesting. And just from the point of view of the way you did a kind of end run around the potentially coercive aspects of that image, and really showed how Hobbes builds a correction into that. That's really fascinating. Yeah. Thank you all again. I really enjoyed this trio.
Owen, I believe, was that a pre-existing question or an old hand?
There was, but I feel like I'll I'll hold it back. That's all right.
Yeah, that's fine. So I believe in that case, Deanna Schumack is next.
Thank you. What a great way to spend a Saturday morning. It was so stimulating and so interesting. I want to ask you something that I don't know if this is fair, but in the spirit of yesterday's conversation, in which there was a good deal of talk, particularly in the keynote, about Hobbes's contemporaneity or his modernity, and the question of his relevance today for urgent discussions that we are all having or need to have. I noticed that both of the papers alluded in more or less explicit ways, more explicit in Joseph's paper, I think, to the issue of acceptable procedures, basically allusions also to election fraud. And since we are daily dealing with accusations and questions about what procedures are acceptable in a modern democracy, and since Peter, in your paper too, which I just found to be so suggestive, this question of the perspicuity of language, we also have a crisis of truth in a post-truth era, as some would call it, that reflects back on that question of how unity can be brought about, particularly if, as you have claimed, I think very suggestively again, you've made claims about the intrinsic metaphorical quality of language. This was brought out also in a way in Owen's comment just a minute ago about the colleges and the university. So I wonder if any or all of you would like to speak in like an everyday way about the usefulness of thinking through Hobbes on this question that we face, not just in the US, but globally.
Well, I guess I'll start. Yeah, so I definitely agree that, I guess what I find really interesting is, of course, Hobbes' argument in Leviathan, but also the responses to Leviathan and the debate between Harrington and Wren, one of the things I like about Harrington is that he, as I read him, he kind of thinks about this the way like anachronistically, a contemporary game theorist might think about this. Like his example of the schoolgirls is kind of like the sorts of examples that Schelling uses. And he's arguing that procedures can fulfill this function. And I think that the example of an electoral procedure fulfilling this kind of function of like, I divide and you shall choose is exactly the way that a contemporary game theorist would think about what elections are doing. It's a mechanism for people to coordinate. And so I don't know the extent to which that, I mean, it feels very like really inappropriate to talk about that in terms of Leviathan. But I think that it points to a set of questions about how to enforce elections. How does coordination work? What are the social conditions under which coordination is possible? That a strict reading of Leviathan would not get you, because there you'd be asking, well, how do you have an actor that's going to enforce this procedure? And how do we all, and the problem is to obey that actor. And so depending upon your view of what elections are doing, if it's a kind of Harringtonian view or a kind of Hobbesian view, then the answer about how to maintain this procedure is going to be really different.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. That was really helpful and interesting. And as everyone here knows, I'm not a Hobbes scholar by any stretch of the imagination. So this has been a very, very interesting couple of days. I've learned a lot.
Okay, are there any final thoughts on that question? No pressure, if not. Okay, in that case, we have a question in the chat from Joshua, and this is a question for Peter. You discussed the pedagogical functions of the Leviathan and the need for the sovereign to be a poetic and aesthetic leader, not just a political one. Do these aspects of the Leviathan, the aesthetic and linguistic ones, trump the political components when it comes to unifying the Commonwealth unto themselves?
Yeah, I think that is a very interesting question, and a very challenging one for me. I think on the one hand, I would like to suggest that it's not as much a matter of the poetic and aesthetic functions trumping the political, or the political trumping the poetic and the aesthetic, than that the political is a matter of essentially is something we could call aesthetic, and that in some ways these are not necessarily the useful categories in Hobbes, and I would like to suggest that the two are mutually constitutive, or in some ways indistinguishable. How politics works for Hobbes is through is in some ways always through what we might want to call aesthetics, and that the division between the political and the aesthetic is not necessarily one to be assigned to Hobbes. So that's kind of one thought that I would have, but that's obviously just the clever strategy, not so clever in my hands, of answering a question by or not answering a question, pretending to answer a question by not answering it and saying, I take issue with the question. So to try to actually answer the question, one thing that I do think is interesting about the ways in which aesthetics or poetics or kind of imagination, fancy, is to think about what Hobbes writes in his response to William Davenant's heroic epic poem Gondibert, the preface to that, that's the poem dedicated to Hobbes, and Hobbes writes a response to it. And he says at one point, and I'll be paraphrasing here, that sometimes poetry needs to take on the the role of the architect, and to take essentially, as I kind of would want to formulate it, poetry personates philosophy, represents philosophy, and if philosophy then, or political philosophy, can be seen as offering a set of kind of more scientific premises that explain issues like coordination, or indeed how that coordination yields the Commonwealth. I think at some point Hobbes nevertheless holds out that while those can go a long way, sometimes the poetic and aesthetic functions, poetry and aesthetics need to step in at some point. So to answer the question, and to take a firm stance, far firmer than I actually am comfortable really, believing in my head. Yes, I do think that at some points the poetic and the aesthetic need to step in, as they do in Leviathan. It has to be called a mortal god for it to work, essentially, I think, or not, it doesn't have to be a mortal god, but something like that needs to happen. And the sovereign in some ways needs to continue to perpetuate that. And I think that gets into some other questions about what kind of person the sovereign needs to be. And David Runciman has argued that the sovereign that one of the kind of scandalous things that Hobbes says about the sovereign is that it can be basically anyone. And I'm not sure if that's entirely true. Maybe it can in theory, but does Hobbes think that would be a particularly good idea? In some ways, the sovereign needs to be someone who can command the kind of the same kind of reverence that the phrase the mortal god would. And so how does that kind of language attach onto the reality of politics? I think is also a question that I wrestle with. Sorry.
Okay, next we have a question from Keith.
First of all, I'd like to thank both Joseph and Peter for really excellent papers, which are really quite provocative in the very best sense of the word. So I really appreciate it. And also I'd like to thank Owen for your really outstanding responses to those papers. I agree with Jane entirely. It's a model of what a good respondent will produce. And so thank you very much. I have a question, which I think I'll invite both of you to respond if you would like to, but I think it's maybe a bit more directed towards Peter than to Joseph. In part because, Peter, you say a bunch of really interesting things in the course of your paper. You talk, for example, about the poiesis of the Commonwealth. You say in a very nice phrase at one point that Hobbes's rhetoric isn't just elocutionary, but illocutionary. I like that phrase a lot. And so it caught my eye. And so that actually raises an interesting question, and one that I talked about a bit in my own paper yesterday, which is there has been for many decades a strong strain of thought within Hobbes scholarship. Right, perhaps going all the way back to Warrender, who, as I noted in my talk, said famously in his book, the great task of Hobbes scholarship today is to identify the logical structure of Leviathan. And as I'd also noted, that he had very precise understanding of what that entailed. Right, that entailed not taking into account things which fell outside of that particular agenda. Right. And so is it fair, first of all, to sort of read your paper as one which is kind of taking dead aim at that view? Or do you view your own work as might possibly being compatible with that view? I would like to know sort of how you position your own paper with respect to that particular outlook. And then, of course, there's also the question of, once again, sort of picking up in some ways on Jane's remark of the frontispiece of Leviathan, right? Because if one does, take Warrender, at his word and agrees that the task is to understand the logical structure of Leviathan, at least on my view, it becomes, utterly unclear, why Hobbes would take the trouble of having the frontispiece that he had on Leviathan, right? This was a third of three, statements of his, political thought that he produced, and if in fact, Hobbes intended, for us to read that entirely as a kind of, logical exercise, then it's, in my view at least, very difficult to then offer an explanation of why he seemed to care so much for the frontispiece, right? It seemed like the frontispiece is important because it is in fact illocutionary, right? He's not just, saying things with words, but he's actually doing things with images. And he thinks that there are perhaps things that you can do with images that you can't do with words, and that's why it's important. So Peter, if you could respond to that, and also Joseph, if you have any, any thoughts of your own on this matter, I'd appreciate it as well.
Yeah, I do think, thank you very much for that question. It is, I do think, very central to what I'm trying to argue. I think insofar as it does an emphasis on the linguistic, the Hobbes' philosophy of language, which I think kind of historically at least emerges out of what is a rhetorical tradition. And I suppose that's one way in which there's a rhetorical dimension to Hobbes. If that is incompatible with, I think there's definitely friction with the objective to read Leviathan as essentially having a kind of logical skeleton and a structure to it. That is in some ways independent of its form. That it has. I said that at one point. It's the form and as distinct from content. And I would say I do perhaps rather strongly disagree with that approach to the text, or disagree as. Yeah, I'll just say I disagree. And I do think that and that's what I tried to get across with the phrase that Hobbes is, his rhetoric is his language of Leviathan. It's not just kind of it's not just an ancillary or secondary or ornamental feature of the text. It's really essential. And I guess the further claim is that Hobbes understood it to be that way. And I suppose those are two different arguments. One thing I think is interesting, however, is of course the repeated points at which Hobbes, and this has been a theme in several of the talks during the conference, about where the points at which Hobbes does indeed make systematic or conscious explicit breaks with certain conceptions of rhetoric, particularly in the humanist tradition. For instance, he redefines inventio in Leviathan, which for the humanists is basically adducing arguments from the storehouse of commonplaces. And Hobbes, he says this, that he calls inventio, quote, the faculty. This is part of the paper I didn't read out loud. The faculty which the Latins call sagacitas or solertia, a hunting out of the causes of some effect, present or past, or of the effects of some present or past cause. And I think that in itself signals a departure from obviously a certain conception of inventio that's rhetorical and moves more towards, I think, what we might consider to be a logical concept of invention, indeed even a modern concept of invention as creating something anew. Yet my argument would be that in many ways the move here is what Hobbes is doing, what he's up to, and to kind of borrow what Quentin Skinner likes to say all the time, what he's up to is actually using, this is a rhetorical move, and this is a linguistic act, obviously in a broad sense, but in a very particular sense too. By proposing his definition of inventio, his new definition of inventio, by reinventing invention, he is doing something that is that cannot be understood as apart from his philosophy of language and the kind of rhetorical context in which that forms. And so to try to draw the very loose thoughts I've been putting forward together is just, I do think that Hobbes, his sense of what his sense of what logic is cannot be taken apart from the sense of rhetoric. Obviously, it's open then for interpreters to nonetheless draw something out of Hobbes that he didn't intend to be there. But insofar as I think in a kind of authentic reading of Leviathan requires that these two be brought closely together.
I think that the question of why include the frontispiece if it's all about the logical structure is interesting. I haven't thought about that before. I was really inspired by Gene Hampton's book, which and the parts about it were like understanding the logical structure of the institutions of social order. So I guess like my initial response is that there are multiple different ways to convey a logical structure. And so in many game theory papers, for instance, you will see pictures because they help us understand what's actually going on, like little diagrams or region plots or something along those lines. And I guess it's weird to think about the frontispiece in that way, but you could understand it perhaps as conveying the logical structure. And so working towards that same end.
Okay, we have about 8 minutes left until we'll take the break. So Owen, this might be a good opportunity to ask your question from earlier if you still wanted to.
Yeah, I'd love to. So it's a question for you, Joseph, and it's about the Harrington cake example, which I have to say I was delighted to learn about this because I did, it's one of these things that I think, oh, that's an example that 20th century analytic philosophers talk about all the time. And then, oh, look, it's there in the 17th century. But actually that put me in mind of, okay, so how does Rawls talk about the very same example and like what the purposes to which he puts it, right? And if I'm remembering correctly, the thought is, well, the cake example is an example of perfect procedural justice, which means there's a procedure independent criterion of justice, of distributive justice, and there's a procedure we can find that would perfectly result in that outcome every time. So if you assume equal distribution is just, then the way to do it among self-interested actors, it always realize that outcome is precisely this Harringtonian cake example. But given that, I thought, well, if we think now go back to Harrington, that means he's assuming implicitly that the parties kind of agree on what a just distribution would be, and they agree that equal distribution is fine. And so that's to say, it assumes that there's some procedure independent standard of what distributive fairness is, and they agree on that, and hence agree on the procedure. Whereas if we just said, well, there's no reason to think that cutting the cake equally in half would be a necessarily just thing, right? Because suppose some person needs more food than the other person, whatever, we could imagine all kinds of reasons, right? So I wondered if you could say more about what you might call the kind of presuppositions of the Harringtonian example. Like you brought out some of those about he doesn't think about neither he nor Matthew Wren think about this audience question. But I wondered if do you think that's another presupposition, that implicitly the parties are agreeing on a conception of fairness?
I'm not sure. I guess I would want to say, I'd want to push back against that. So what I would want to say is like Harrington's primary concern is freedom from domination by the sovereign. And so what really matters in the example is that both girls are constrained. Neither can just say like, oh, okay, I get everything and you can have like whatever my whim says, you can have the rest of it. And so it is true that Harrington emphasizes the equality of the distribution. And but I think what really matters is the way in which private interests can be aligned through procedures towards the public interest. And we can, of course, imagine any variety of procedures that would result in different kinds of outcomes. He really liked that specific example. He was as impressed with it as Wren was unimpressed. And so I don't know. Nothing comes to mind of like alternative examples or ways in which he explored, like in some cases this is better. He was primarily using it as an example, like as an analogy to a kind of bicameral legislature. And so, but yeah, I think the importance of it is that both actors are constrained. And so therefore neither dominates the other.
Great, thank you.
If we have a few minutes, I might respond to Owen's comments from earlier, if that's okay. And so you know, if I'm characterizing your comments correctly, you were questioning whether obedience to the sovereign is really a coordination problem, or whether a coordination problem is the best way to think about that. And so I kind of have two responses. One is that I think it's actually, I do want to think about it as a coordination problem, like driving on one side of the street or the other, where in this case, perhaps the selection of the individual or assembly who's sovereign would be which side of the street to drive on. And I think it's even more clear in elements of law that it's best thought of as coordination rather than as like an individual going out punishing deviators. And because Hobbes says in elements of law, you know, no one can really transfer one's power to another. Like you're not physically giving all the guns to a particular individual, but rather what you're transferring is your right of resisting the sovereign. And so there, I think it really like, you know, he massaged the language in Leviathan, but like, it's really clearly, to me, at least, like, it's about what everyone's agreeing to. The second point I'd make is, you know, there's not really, the line is somewhat subtle between a coordination problem and a collective action problem, particularly in repeated games, because in repeated games, any set of strategies, there's a wide variety of possible set of strategies that individuals can coordinate on. And so really what happens in repeated games is that the collective action problems become coordination problems. And so that would be another way of responding to your question. But thank you for your comments. I really appreciate it.
Okay, well, if there are no more comments, we may as well break now for 12 minutes. Thank you to both of our presenters and to our discussant for some really, really great comments and presentations. As it's just a short break, I would recommend staying in the meeting and just turning audio and videos off. And I really encourage everyone to join us for the second half. We have two more great panelists and another great discussant. Ryan has very kindly shared the schedule in the chat. Yeah, so see you all in about 10 minutes. Okay, so welcome back, everyone. I hope you had a nice break. So moving on now to part two, we'll be opening with Chelsea Lee's paper, which is a condensed version of a larger project. And the paper is entitled Early Modern Anatomy and the Judgment of Shakespeare's Threatened Skins. And Chelsea is a PhD student of English at UCLA. Her research has included early modern literature, Shakespeare, and the topic of death. And she has previously completed an internship at the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust. So I'll pass over to Chelsea.
Okay. Is the sound coming through all right? Okay, perfect. So as Holly was mentioning, this is sort of an excerpt and a condensed version of a longer project. And the segue sort of from Hobbes into this project is thinking about kind of anatomical mapping, the value of anatomical metaphor and anatomical thought, which I'm specifically looking at in conjunction with performances of Shakespeare and violence done to skin on the stage in the early modern period. So hopefully not too much coherence is lost in the condensing. To begin, I sort of want to establish the prevalent thoughts or discussions that were occurring around skin in the anatomical texts that were emerging during the early modern period, specifically focusing around the end of the 1500s into sort of later in the 1600s, specifically in England. So an investigation into the way these early modern anatomical texts characterize skin reveals three persisting conversations that would occur throughout most of the texts. The first is a desire on the part of the physician or anatomist writing these texts to justify their classification of the skin as either a spermatic or a bloody part. and most come to the conclusion that skin must be a combination of both. The specifics of that I will get into a bit later. The second discussion, and one which perhaps has the most ontological significance to this specific presentation, is the division of the parts of the skin. Specifically, many of the texts focus on the distinction between the epidermis and what they often call the true skin beneath. The third involves thinking about skin and figuring out the presence of feeling within skin as an organ and whether it is capable of feeling and sensation. This third one will be less focused on in this particular presentation, and I'll be focusing more on these first two concepts. So as I kind of dig into these texts, these anatomical treatises seem to portray a rhetoric that espouses an underlying stability of whiteness and Christianity as inherent in the human body. And I'm thinking about approaching Shakespeare while using this rhetoric as a lens has interesting implications when we consider those plays in which a racial outsider undergoes or is associated with bodily violence, specifically violence which pierces the skin. So as I was mentioning, among these anatomical treatises, when each discusses the topic of skin, they describe that organ as only being partly spermatical. And this has to do with this early conception of the way the body is formed. And in these texts, they determine whether different parts of the body derived either from the blood or the sperm. And each sort of part had to have its designation. The parts of the body that were considered spermatic are parts that are like the bones, ones that are solid, white, and unchanging, or incapable of regeneration. Parts that are sanguine are the fleshy members that can be reformed or renewed from the blood. We can see, and we often see in these texts, that the skin complicates this discussion and the distinction between the two. When skin is damaged, it does not simply regenerate, but it does scar and heal. And yet it also has this sort of assumed solid white appearance in many of the texts that harkens back to a spermatical construction. The presupposed whiteness is often what causes much confusion in the distinction of these texts. One example comes from Thomas Winston's anatomical texts, where we see him grappling with the distinction between the two. He describes skin as a thin coat drawn over the skin, white, without blood, as Galen would have it. It is begotten not ex semine, for then it could never after a loss be repaired, not of spermatical parts, as nerves and veins brought to the skin, and there thickened and spread, so it should have sense and blood and be red, but it is white. We can see how Winston treats the whiteness of the skin as the absolute basis for his analysis. The first thing he mentions is that this outer skin is white, even though later in his text, he admits an awareness of darker skin. In fact, he completely ignores the reality of darker or black skin until he can use it to prove the legitimacy of his other theories. Until that point, we are meant to accept that skin is always white as a rule, even when this whiteness causes the most difficulty in creating an actual understanding of skin's classification. It should be easy to dismiss the skin as clearly non-spermatic, but the assumed standard of whiteness makes it impossible to associate it completely with the blood. This gesturing to a foundational whiteness will become even more present when we look at the discussion of the epidermis and its distinction from the true skin. In most of these treatises, when they begin their description of the skin, they begin with the epidermis, and they make sure to account for its distinction from the true skin, which it covers. Epidermis is the Greek term, but these English texts seem to prefer the terms cuticle or scarf skin when referring to it. As might be surmised by those names, the epidermis is only that outermost layer of skin. It is the aesthetic skin, but what really matters to these anatomists is what it covers. Another anatomist, Helkiah Crook, states that under this curtain or scarf lieth the true and genuine skin. And this distinction of truth becomes significant when we realize the description of this true layer of skin is also dominated with references to its whiteness. Multiple texts acknowledge differences in skin color, but also dismiss it quickly as merely being the covering for an ultimately white base. A 1653 text states, quote, that even in blackamoors, under the black thin skin, it is white, end quote. These are not technically inaccurate observations. Modern anatomy shows that the basal layer, which contains the pigment, resides only in the thin epidermis. But the way these anatomical texts juxtapose the language of black and white causes some discomfort. Again, we see the dismissal of black skin as ultimately unimportant. It is described as thin and almost negligible. It is used merely as an example to contrast the persistent whiteness of the true skin. One could argue that the texts are more positively pointing out a universal similarity between all people, but its rejection of dark skin in order to focus on universal whiteness is troubling. This universal whiteness is also connected to a Christian claiming of the human body. As Crook's title, Microcosmographia, implies, and as the text itself explicitly states, the human body is merely a mirror of the divine. Yet we can imagine how people would feel anxiety over the representational similarity to God when there are examples of clear divergences in skin color. This division of the epidermis from a white whole allows for a diversity in skin while still claiming a type of white Christian source for the body. So taking this information and looking at two of Shakespeare's most racially charged plays, The Merchant of Venice and Othello, we can begin to track how this anatomical rhetoric of skin bleeds into performances and how it often serves to reinforce a white standard. So beginning with The Merchant of Venice, it's one of Shakespeare's plays that grapple with the position of racial identity within the human body. It is also a play wherein the climax relies upon extended meditation on meditation on the image of piercing through the skin to reach an interior flesh. In this play, the racial other is Shylock, a Jewish man, and this inward deviation from Christianity becomes associated with a blackening of the skin and a distortion of the blood. When Shylock learns of Jessica's elopement, he declares, "I say, my daughter is my flesh and blood," to which Cellario replies, "There is no more difference between thy flesh and hers than between jet and ivory, more between your bloods than there is between red wine and Rhenish." Shylock becomes associated with dark skin and impure blood, which is set up as a direct contrast for what should be the standard, which is white skin and pure red blood. These lines suggest a desire to draw religious difference into a display in the epidermis where one might not naturally be found. As mentioned, early modern skin increasingly became a site of ontological importance, but it was also fraught with uncertainty. Therefore, the presence of the Jewish other that is not immediately identifiable within the skin would be of utmost concern. We see this need for distinction playing out in the description of Shylock's difference, whereas Jessica, who is amenable to Christian conversion, is allowed to retain her white state. The relationship between blood and flesh harkens back to the spermatic and sanguine debates around the skin. This becomes even more significant when we consider how Shylock's pursuit of his pound of flesh progresses. Shylock's revenge relies upon the spermatic nature of the skin. When Shylock proposes the deal to Antonio, he describes the forfeit in terms of cutting and removal. He states, "Let the forfeit be nominated for an equal pound of your fair flesh, to be cut off and taken in what part of your body pleaseth me." The completion of the bond lies in Shylock's desire to remove the flesh, a removal that cannot be regenerated due to the spermatic nature of the skin. The spermatic association is further solidified by Shylock's reference to the flesh as fair. The entire power of the exchange relies upon the knowledge that flesh is partially spermatic. And for a moment, Shylock seems to triumph, and it appears he will be able to pierce through Antonio's epidermis and claim a chunk of spermatic flesh. However, Shylock is thwarted by skin's partially bloody nature. a nature that is explicitly connected to Christianity in the play. Shylock is warned that he may not spill so much as one drop of Christian blood, or else his life and property are forfeit. As the anatomical discourse states, the blood is the more mutable and renewable material of the body, and in this play it is claimed by Christianity. The skin, which is composed of white sperm and Christian blood, becomes the impenetrable barrier Shylock cannot overcome. Shylock's final sentence involves a forced baptism, which further reinforces the predominance of Christian blood in the play. Shylock's potential redemption rests in the mercy of a forced conversion, and in this conversion, his sanguine parts will be balanced in Christianity. The threat of violence to the flesh becomes the gateway through which Christian blood can gain the victory, and it only achieves its triumph because of the hybrid spermatic sanguine composition of the skin. Moving on briefly to Othello, we can see some interesting parallels to the concept of interior whiteness found in the anatomical treatises. Throughout the play, Othello is constantly joined together with blackness. Iago refers to him as Black Othello, and Othello himself declares, "I am black." While his outward skin seems inextricably tied to his identity, the Duke defends him by referencing a potential whiteness in his character. The Duke refers to Othello as far more fair than black, which acknowledges Othello's blackness in order to dismiss it in favor of an overreaching whiteness. There is more of the fair than the black, and just as the thinness of the black skin is overwhelmed by the white of the true skin in the anatomical texts. It is a rhetoric that puts whiteness and blackness in a contest over the geography of a person, and in both cases, the whiteness is given the majority. Othello's death in the context of the other deaths of the play is unique. Othello's death is the only one that is self-administered. He stabs himself, piercing through the black epidermis and crossing the blade into that white dominated territory of the true skin underneath. Othello's death marks the beginning of a self-dissection, an uncovering in which he reads himself to the audience, even as he prepares to pierce his last remaining cover. It is his moment of greatest vulnerability. Othello begs those around him to speak of me as I am, even as he is preparing to kill himself. Othello's entire final speech is a plea for identity that culminates in breaching the scarf skin. The tragedy of Othello then becomes rooted in a character who attempts to create an identity that penetrates beneath his exterior skin to conform to a type of interior white standard. However, such a pursuit can only be accomplished through violence to the exterior skin and will lead to self-destruction. In contrast, we have Desdemona's death, in which her pure white exterior remains unmarred. In fact, Desdemona's manner of death is the only one which occurs on stage that does not involve some sort of damage to the skin. Othello even specifically states a desire to preserve her skin as a motive for his method of murder. He states, "Yet I'll not shed her blood, nor scar that whiter skin of hers than snow, and smooth as monumental alabaster." Desdemona is equated with her white skin, and in her death, her white skin must not be harmed. While there are many deaths in this tragedy, there are really only two methods used: the smothering of Desdemona and the stabbing of everyone else. This unique method of death only serves to set Desdemona's corpse apart from all the others, and this is important because Desdemona's unmarred corpse remains displayed on the stage for the majority of the final act. This generates an interesting interplay in the final visual of the drama, wherein Othello's and Desdemona's corpses are gestured to together on the bed. Desdemona, the symbol of whiteness, died in a manner that left her white skin unmarred, while Othello's dark skin is divided and breached by his own actions. The implications of these anatomical texts are rather chilling when applied to these Shakespearean characters. The invisible white Christian standard set forward in the anatomical treatises sets up a system in which the characters who do not fit this mold are forced to exist in a world in which their own bodies work against them. Shylock even invokes his bodily similarity. He states, "I am a Jew. Hath not a Jew eyes, hath not a Jew hands, organs, dimensions, senses, affections, passions, fed with the same food, hurt with the same weapons, subject to the same diseases, healed by the same means, warmed and cooled by the same winter and summer as a Christian is? If you prick us, do we not bleed?" Shylock marks out his body with clear appeals to anatomical similarity. There is an appeal here to a universal understanding centered in the body, but this is an image that is ultimately betrayed by the outcome of the trial. The bodily similarities only seem to push the characters to fixate on the differences. The reference to Jewish blood remains unanswered, but the threat to Christian blood orchestrates Shylock's downfall. The parallel of the images only serves to highlight how much weight the Christian blood holds in comparison. The early anatomical text can be seen, at least on the surface, as rather harmless empirical explorations. When acknowledgements of alternative skin colors other than white appear, they are not treated with outward hostility. Yet when anatomical texts talk about skin, that skin is presumed white unless otherwise specified. These texts represent attempts to understand the human body and how human beings form identities with their bodies. Privileging universal whiteness in these texts sets a dangerous precedent. As evidenced by Shakespeare's plays, when a body does not fit the established norm, violence is often used as a corrective. In closing, I want to think about this paper sort of in connection with interdisciplinary distinctions and wondering how far we can consider the anatomical mappings and lens as sort of successful for the readings of these texts, particularly when it is sort of unclear how far we can take the influence of such texts on Shakespeare himself in the composition. So those are sort of the questions that I am bringing to sort of the interlinking of sort of anatomy and Shakespeare, particularly in the subject of the skin. Thank you.
Thank you, Chelsea, for that really interesting presentation. Next, we have JC Fermin, and he's presenting his paper, More Fair Than Black, the Effacement of Black Suffering in Early Modern Dramas. He is a PhD student of English at UC Irvine, whose research focuses on post-colonial theory and the Philippine diaspora, but also extends to Afro-pessimism, decolonial feminisms, and non-Western radical traditions. So passing over to JC.
Thank you very much, Holly. And thank you as well to everybody here, for the very thrilling opportunity. I'm going to share the screen and cross my fingers, right, that this works to show a PowerPoint presentation that I prepared. Apologies in advance as well. This is not really a sort of direct engagement with the ensemble, of questions framed through Hobbes and Leviathan, right? It's more of a response to assumptions and methods in early modern scholarly production. I hope this is actually working because there's a little bit of lag from where I'm currently viewing
it is. You can see it. Don't worry.
Okay, cool. On my end, it's kind of like struggling to show the slide. Can everybody see this?
Yeah.
All right, perfect. So without further ado, let me just, sorry, it's toggling in and out of the same presentation. I think this works.
Is there a gray box sort of in front of the screen?
Yeah, I think my computer is having trouble displaying the
really quick, try this. Open,
yes.
Just display the presentation to yourself. And then when you go to share screen, choose the PowerPoint application.
Explicit. Okay, so let me see.
Like have it in present mode first, and then share the presented. We'll see if that does it.
Is there any?
Yep, that looks good.
All right, perfect. Thank you for everyone's patience here regarding these technical difficulties. But without further ado, this is my presentation, More Fair Than Black. And I guess to begin, right, to set the stage, across Shakespeare's Othello, Ben Jonson's The Mask of Blackness, and George Peele's The Battle of Alcazar, there is this distinct tendency among these plays to efface, trivialize, or instrumentalize Black suffering in ways that lend themselves to an Afro-pessimist reading, among other things. Afro-pessimism offers concepts that I find indispensable in grasping the structural positions of Othello, Niger's daughters, and Mully Muhammad. What notion of a world, for instance, are these characters forced to navigate and negotiate with? How is each play animated by anxieties in English civil society about the mere presence of Blackness? These questions lead me to consider the Afro-pessimist notion of gratuitous violence, whereby Blackness is beholden to policing and destruction for their own sake, without being entirely explainable by other regimes of violence, such as settler colonialism and labor exploitation. So, published in 1997, Emily Bartell's article, Othello and Africa, Postcolonialism Reconsidered, represents a past tendency in early modern scholarship to suggest that anti-Blackness in the period was more discursive and structural. I argue that this is a false dichotomy. Rather, structural anti-Blackness reinforces discursive anti-Blackness and vice versa. This recognition will provide a better understanding of the way Blackness is constructed within each play's very production. My goal today is to highlight the continued primacy of this recognition through the lenses afforded by interventions in critical Black studies. Importantly, interventions against contributions like Bartell's have already made their mark. Ayanna Thompson reflects on the fact that in the past, some scholars have argued that the malleability and inconsistency of racialized discourses in the early modern period are evidence that Shakespeare and his contemporaries were not engaged in a racialized epistemology. Let me be clear, she says, critical race theory has slain that dragon. Constructions of race are indeed inconsistent and opportunistic. So how has this dragon been slain? First, I turn to Bartell's engagement with Othello. Generally, she suggests that the anxieties at play in Othello cannot ever have resonated with the paradigms of post-colonialism, such that a linear view of England's conquest of Africa cannot accurately foreground a reading of Othello. With the Portuguese, Spanish, French, and Dutch aggressively making claims over more and more of the world, Bartell says, the English found themselves backed into a corner and dared to come out. These pressures should have guaranteed some capitalizing on Africa as other, if Africa really was a target of domination, and if the assumption that targets of domination were routinely othered holds true. But they, in fact, did not. Because of England's tardiness towards conquest, Bartell's expresses little faith in the salience of Africa as other in Shakespeare's time. As a result, Bartell seems to underestimate the power of this imagery to foment both the anti-Black violence already present during the period and its systemic expansion alongside English colonialism. Jennifer Morgan lays this out plainly through her claim that the process by which Africans became Blacks who became slaves was initiated through a series of encounters made manifest in literary descriptions and only later expanded by quotidian dimensions of slave ownership and settlement, including the publication of images of Black people. So, whereas Bartell's holds anti-Blackness to be thoroughly discursive, Morgan does not take for granted the immediate and eventual violence that such a discourse catalyzes. To call this dynamic quotidian, Morgan implies the normalization of anti-Blackness in early modernity, a distancing between the ontological profile of the white early modern subject and the ontological void represented by the Black non-subject. Conversely, Bartell's reading of Othello entails both a radical disjunction between a world that would acknowledge and embrace a moral Venice to one that would rather put him in chains like a circumcised dog. She expresses an investment in the possibility of Othello's uncompromised participation in Venetian society, taking for granted that his ostensibly vaunted status might be contingent on his instrumental value as a soldier. So while certain comments on race in Othello can be dismissed as innocuous, such moments betray a more subtle anti-Blackness than any conspicuous action of Iago's. As the Duke says to Brabantio of Othello, "If virtue no delight of beauty lack, your son-in-law is far more fair than black." Here, Othello's usefulness as a soldier affords him an exceptionalism that seems to transcend his Blackness, ennobling the Duke to want to pardon Othello. However, the Duke's elevation of Othello's fairness entails the denigration of his Blackness. The fact of Othello's Blackness is taken as something that needs to be transcended in the first place. As such, Kyle Grady claims that a more compelling indication of the play's prejudice is actually those racialized sentiments, such as the Duke's, that find endorsement alongside the show of tolerance. Furthermore, the Duke's ameliorative rejoinder to Brabantio that his son-in-law is far more fair than black only reinforces the hierarchical system of prejudices that subtend Brabantio's racialist assessment, expressed through the latter's disapproval of Desdemona's relationship with Othello. Ultimately, the Duke's clemency in the face of Brabantio's intolerance rearticulates rather than undoes the prejudices Othello faces. Thus, the Duke who seems most welcoming of Othello is not wholeheartedly so. Hence, Kyle Grady attempts to wrest the play from readings that encourage the notion that ostensibly mitigating factors, such as Othello's prominent occupation, contravene rather than converge with the play's racialism. Thus, Grady reads against past scholarship's tendency to selectively attribute and thus downplay Othello's racism. The Duke's clemency cannot stand as a mitigating factor to the play's racialism, as to him, Othello's blackness is ultimately nothing worth celebrating. Rather, the Duke prizes what Othello offers despite his blackness. Although Bartel's reading would attribute Iago's evocations of Othello's devilry to Iago's individual malevolence, the play labors to reveal how Iago marshals anti-blackness in Venetian society to orchestrate Othello's ruin. Even if Iago is eventually punished for his machinations, he preys upon anti-black prejudices, such as Brabantio's, to successfully ostracize Othello. For Brabantio, claims Ian Smith, blackness is the self-evident contrast to whiteness, wealth, beauty, and national belonging. And yet there is more. Blackness is also the sign of denuded humanity and evacuated subjectivity, of man diminished as an inconsequential thing. Although Othello and the Duke successfully diffuse the situation, Brabantio expends great energy towards the possibility of enacting gratuitous violence upon Othello at a moment's notice. Brabantio goes on to call Othello an abuser of the world, insinuating an antagonism between Othello and the world entirely. Brabantio's haste to dispatch Othello no longer seems to stem solely from a combination of racist hatred and a desire to protect his daughter. For Brabantio, what is more at stake is the threat Othello poses as an abuser of the world. Brabantio's very sense of world relies on Othello's social death by virtue of his blackness. A world antagonistic to blackness is also in Ben Jonson's The Mask of Blackness. The play introduces the daughters of a black deity named Niger. The daughters stand as Niger's beauteous race, who, though but black in face, yet they are bright and full of life and light, to prove that beauty best, which not the color but the feature, assures unto the creature. Once more, blackness is held as a feature to be transcended. In this case, Niger's daughters are bright and full of life and light, in contrast to their being black in face. But these qualifying factors do not satisfy them. They all actively seek Britannia, a place ruled by a sun that to this height doth grace it, bearing light that is of force to blanch an Ethiop and revive a corpse. The object of their search is not merely Britannia, but the nation's capacity to blanch an Ethiop and turn each daughter white. Whiteness, as more than an object of desire for these black women, inaugurates them to a telos, from which blackness is foreclosed. Thus, it might be more productive to construe Niger's daughters not solely as characters in a play, but as characters being played by white women. According to Bernadette Andrea, the play featured King James' Queen, Anne of Denmark, and her ladies as black beauties, and the multiple contests of authority during the play's production, for grounds the problematic status of English women's political, domestic, and textual agency. On the one hand, it highlights their resistance to the intensifying male supremacism of the time. On the other, it reveals their complicity with an emerging institutional racism. Through Niger's daughters, then, blackness serves as what Frank Wilderson calls a necessary implement, an implement, that is, for Queen Anne's attempts to secure white English women's political, domestic, and textual agency. Thus, the Mask of Blackness denigrates blackness to elevate white womanhood. Black suffering is effaced by its trivializing as an implement to be worn for any ostensible subversiveness. Queen Anne's investment in highlighting her fair white beauty at the expense of black people, which informs her subsequent proto-feminist performance of fair blackness in The Mask of Blackness, cannot be seen apart from the emerging denigration of blackness and the mass exploitation of black people it both illuminates and underwrites. Niger's daughters can enunciate a teleological claim because their blackness is only a proxy for white womanhood and not blackness per se. Through her patronage of the play, Queen Anne does not demonstrate an interest in ending sexist oppression, as that would also entail the equitable treatment of Black women. She would sooner reorganize structures of power in her favor than disrupt them entirely. Likewise, an obeisance to structures of power, specifically English colonialism, is revealed in George Peele's The Battle of Alcazar. Just as the Mask of Blackness pedestalizes Britannia, the Battle of Alcazar presents an English vision of the world. Even if England is not a major participant in the titular conflict, the play leaves no corner untouched by the eventuality of English domination. Mully Muhammad, the antagonist who stirs the play's conflict between Morocco and Portugal, cannot seem to escape his own structural position. At the start of the play, the Portuguese presenter describes Mully as black in his look and bloody in his deeds, and in his shirt stained with a cloud of gore, presents himself with naked sword in hand, accompanied, as you now may behold, with devils coded in the shapes of men. To the presenter, Mully's blackness and wickedness are coterminous, and the understanding that this moment imparts prepares early modern audiences for Mully's inevitable destruction. Mully's entourage, devils coded in the shapes of men, are similarly castigated for their blackness, much as Iago associates Othello with devilry. Furthermore, Mully is contrasted with his uncle, Abdelmelek, who deposed him from the Moroccan throne. Calcipius Bashar, who leads the Turks in support of Abdelmelek, describes Abdelmelek as courteous and honorable. Unlike Mully, whose black and bloody presence promises instability throughout the play, the courteous and honorable Abdelmelek promises stability. And though Abdelmelek and Mully are both Moors, the play fixates on Mully's blackness, as if to say the Moorish Abdelmelek lacks a damning blackness of his own. To that effect, Matthew Chapman claims that the play positions Abdelmelek as white through his relationship to and capacity for honor that is recognized by other subjects. Through the division of Moors into white and black, the play incorporates all Moors a priori into civil society. Rather than Moorishness composing the abject of humanity, Chapman claims that through the character of Mully Muhammad, blackness is the key element of abjection. Because Othello is both black and a Moor, the locus for abjection regarding his character has been debated across early modern scholarship. Abdelmelek and Mully, however, present direct contrasts that affirm Chapman's insights, such that Mully is blameworthy by virtue of his blackness, and Abdelmelek is praiseworthy by virtue of his non-blackness. From this, Abdelmelek and Mully can be construed as spiritual precursors to two interpretations of Othello. Abdelmelek for the Othello that is ostensibly accepted by society at the beginning of the play, and Mully for the Othello who embraces the negative exceptionalism of blackness already imputed onto him. Their racialization informs how the play frames their deeds, validating Abdelmelek while invalidating Mully. Saliently, Mully's ambitions are not dissimilar to the play's English character, Thomas Stukely, who proclaims that I am the Marquess now of Ireland the Maid, and will be shortly King of Ireland. King of a molehill had I rather be than the richest subject of monarchy. Though both Mully and Stukely have violent ambitions, the play never challenges Stukely's designs. Stukely even perishes before the end of the play, but his motives go unquestioned, his dying soliloquy framed as momentously tragic. Mully is not afforded the same dignity in death. His blackness becomes the subject of a horrific spectacle, skinned by Moroccan forces only for the disembodied skin to be stuffed and put on display as a warning to future enemies. Mully's fate epitomizes the abject qualities attributed to his black skin, such as his social death. Throughout this presentation, I have sought to identify early modern conceptions of blackness as consistent in their anti-black imputations of social death. I believe this approach is necessary to motivate further research on the material anti-black violence that took place in the early modern period. As such, my own reception of these plays is an attempt to recenter the anti-blackness embedded in each. Even if it can be argued that anti-blackness today versus anti-blackness back then differs in important ways, I suggest that they are similar in essential ways. Anti-blackness and black suffering still serve as the scaffolding for the coherence of early modern human subjects, many of whom are importantly non-black, even if some are Moors. These plays are many things, but it cannot be understated that they insist on the primacy of white Englishness as the model of human subjectivity and agency, affordances that are sustained by the deprivation of both from the Black socially dead being. And that'll be all for my presentation. Thank you all for listening, and I look forward to any questions and comments. Thank you.
Thank you, JC, for that really thought-provoking presentation. Apologies, I keep getting notifications about my internet, so sorry if I'm cutting out at all. But yeah, thank you. That was a great presentation, really interesting. I'll now pass over to our discussant for this panel, Hunter Hilinski. And Hunter is a political science graduate student at UC Irvine, and his research covers a number of topics, including critical theory, race, and the history of political thought. So thank you, Hunter. I'll now pass over to you.
Thanks, Holly. And thanks for putting this together. This has really been awesome. So like Owen, I also joined pretty late, but I'm really glad that I did. And I'm excited to sort of get into these works. So, before I jump in, I just want to sort of say that I think these critical approaches to these early texts, especially with a racial lens, are not only important, but interesting in the sort of subtleties that they offer. I think it's a theoretical approach that's more of a reading with and not a sort of imposition of concepts onto, but it's a reading with indifference, if not to overcome it, at least to affirm it. And I think with the sort of the way critical race theory now is so hotly debated and contested and being eliminated in schools, that these spaces like this offer really important, moments to discuss these things, because they're constantly under attack. There's these constant sort of encirclings, as Fred Moten would call them. And so we're always renegotiating those horizons for these kind of approaches. So we should be aware of that. But, first I want to point out what I see as sort of a common thread through both before I get into some questions, and I'll try not to take up too much time. So we see this focus in both Chelsea and JC's work on the body and the discourse that surrounds the body, which I think is really interesting. So Chelsea actually refers to this as like the geography of a person, which I thought was a really nice way of putting it. So in her work especially, we see this relationship between the spermatic and the bloody. And, so the spermatic is sort of solid, like bones and white, and imposes this sort of universal condition of whiteness, she says. And in these spermatical constructions, even when skin is scarred and when skin is pierced, there's still this sort of, in the spermatical construction, there's this return to whiteness and this foundation of whiteness. And whiteness of the true skin, she says, lies beneath this sort of what I regard as like what they conceive of as like an unimportant black layer of the skin. And there's not just this intense focus on the skin of the body in Chelsea's work, but also this transition to a discursive significance, which she says could point to this sort of universal similarity. But instead, this discursive nature actually rejects dark skin in order to focus on a universal notion of whiteness, be it medically or godly. And I think, this shows, as she says again, that black skin is used merely as a contrast for the whiteness of true skin. And so all of this kind of relies on this dominance of whiteness as its foundation, the dominance of whiteness as the foundation for understanding difference. And we are told, again, that what stabilizes this difference and what stabilizes this form of domination is either divine or white or both. And so we see this, and I think one of the critical parts of her work is that there's this need in the very essence of its uncovering and looking at these early texts, this method of destabilizing that foundation and of destabilizing the foundation upon which whiteness and therefore black domination rests, reinscribing the sensitivity of feeling or notions of feeling onto the outer skin, as well as providing a sort of newfound ontological significance for it. And, so moving on to JC's work, we also, see this relationship between the body and discourse. And, I think so, he mentions these subtle notions of anti-blackness. Early modern conceptions of blackness are consistent with this sort of anti-blackness of social death, drawn from the Afro-pessimist tradition. And this central point is interesting because it points to this sort of dialectic, that structural anti-Blackness reinforces the discursive and vice versa. And so similar to Chelsea, this discursive nature of Black domination, which can be subtle but can also be very explicit at times, leads to notions of domination that affect and very often destroy the body or the victim of structural anti-Blackness. JC points to this sort of need in these plays to transcend this imposed condition, and how this is sort of related to the discourse, not only at the time, but in the writings themselves. So I think this dialectic not only joins the body or systemic anti-Blackness or structural anti-Blackness, but also the discursive or the narrative forms of anti-Blackness that we see persist. But also, as JC shows, this also portrays the nature and the difference of Black death as a product of this dialectic. So we see death in the case of Mooley, which is this sort of like, it's regarded as this terrible, horrific spectacle. A death which is both social, that is to say discursive, and structural or bodily, skinned by those Moroccan forces, as opposed to the death of Thomas Schuylkill as momentously tragic. Similarly, in Chelsea's work, we see this contrast between Desdemona, whose skin remains unmarred, and Othello's death, who dies by his own hand and pierces his skin. And this reminded me, there's a quote by Ta-Nehisi Coates, who says that the spectacle of Black death is essential to the mental health of the world. And I think that these ideas of death as this sort of spectacle in its relationship to not only structural domination, but also discursive, is sort of persistent in both works. And I think you guys show it in different ways, but it's really fascinating to me. So a couple questions that I have, and this isn't my wheelhouse, but hopefully I give you guys something to think about. So Chelsea, you mentioned this like epistemic anxiety at the very beginning of the paper. And you say it existed in those early modern periods when it comes to variations in skin color. I'm wondering though, does this epistemic anxiety still exist now in more subversive forms? And this is the sort of political theorist in me, thinking about how do we apply these early reinterpretations of text to politics now? How do they allow us to think presently? So I'm wondering, does that epistemic anxiety exist? Because I was sort of returning to that phrase while I was reading your entire paper, thinking about where that existed, how it persisted. You also mentioned this sort of disentangling of a broader cultural method of thought. And I'm wondering, again, not whether you accomplish it, because I think you do, but how we might continue doing so actively now, both in our theoretical approaches and also in our politics. And then finally, so JC, I'm wondering, again, and this is the political theorist in me, how does an understanding of the social, in addition to the bodily death of these characters, find relevance today? Afro-pessimism, I think, establishes the idea that Blackness and Black bodies are integral parts of history, yet they're excluded constantly in explicit and implicit forms. But their exclusion, as Coates mentioned, is necessary for the mental health of the world, or so it has been up to this point in history. So how would that inform us actively, and how could it? I think these questions sort of speak to your conclusions. I think they would sort of find space there. But again, thank you both so much. I enjoyed them a lot, and that's all I have. So thank you.
Thank you, Hunter, for those great comments. Yeah, and also for volunteering your time as a discussant. Yeah, also really appreciated. So we'll move on now to the Q&A, and we'll follow the same format as last time. So you can either use a Zoom hand or comment in the chat, which I'll endeavor to read out as best as I can. Okay, so we have a question from Julia.
Hi, I just want to thank both of you for those great papers. Very well presented, thought out, presented, really nice work. My question for Chelsea, at the end, you raised the question of sort of influence and how much the argument depends on Shakespeare, being familiar with these anatomical texts. I wonder if one way to think about that is that that some of these ideas are shared differently by drama and by anatomy, and that there's some underlying ideas there that are being articulated, and if so, are they being articulated differently in drama versus anatomy? Like, but maybe that would help with that help you get around that question of what it means to bring these two things together without having to argue for a direct connectivity.
Yeah, that's sort of really useful in thinking about the connection, because sort of as I was mentioning, the tenuous influence on Shakespeare is kind of apparent, at least in terms of what we know specifically and how far we can impose and influence on kind of any specific author. And sort of I was seeing the survey of the anatomical text and potentially as capturing some sense of an ongoing conversation and sort of a social milieu of thought that potentially could exist in a way that would be sort of dipped into and pulled out from through different sort of modes of thought, media presentation. And specifically, it's interesting in the ways that the anatomical texts, at least some of them, specifically state that they recognize the influence of anatomy onto art, specifically kind of poetry, and their desire for their texts to be instructive to physicians and surgeons, but also to potentially benefit artistic productions as well. But I do think that the concept that both sort of the theater and performance is dealing with sort of different ideas of the representation, and also the anatomists are existing on kind of this other plane, and that in the difference there is kind of like the connection that can be made to maybe get a broader sort of cultural understanding of the representations, I think is quite apt.
Thank you.
So as there are no other questions at the moment, would any of the presenters like to respond to Hunter's comments?
Sure. Yeah, thank you again for the generative commentary, Hunter, to both of our presentations. And regarding your questions, right, how does an understanding of social and bodily death find relevance today, especially in the context of your evocation, right, of Ta-Nehisi Coates' exclusion of Black people being necessary for the mental health of the world? Not to like make this too contemporaneous, right, but that sort of spectacle we find in Molly Muhammad's fate, right? Even the whole ordeal of Othello's suicide, right, being this subject on a stage play. The destruction of Black skin, as Chelsea was discussing, like kind of does persist in perhaps the virality, right, of the sort of like murder of Black people by the state, right? The sort of propensity for displays of state violence, police brutality, etc., to kind of just find their way to people's, news feeds. And I think that does continue to speak to like a tendency that I think has only recently, right, in the past perhaps decade, been unearthed in reception to the past, to early modern studies. When I wrote this paper, it was in a seminar format of like about 20 something words. So I also did the work of condensing the argument to a presentation genre. But I definitely had a more concerted emphasis on like addressing the sort of predominant assumptions during the time of like, right, the late 90s, Emily Bartels, who, makes this very issues a very useful challenge to the narrative, the very straightforward narrative of like post-colonialism as like, here's, indigenous land, here's domination, and then etc. She's kind of pushing against that, but at the same time, her conclusions are what I was challenging in this presentation, right? To dismiss the sort of like imminent violence that was happening to colonized subjects, especially Black colonized subjects. This is all to say that in terms of informing us actively, right? We can look to, I guess, the rising tide of early modern scholarship, such as Kyle Grady's and Bernadette Andrea's, where they see how these issues of death persist, bodily death, social death, they persist today, but also were they perhaps present in the early modern period as well, in a manner that has yet to be, fully acknowledged or understood through these frameworks. And how can that be done, right, without becoming a historical, apocryphal, etc. And I think that's the task I'm modestly contributing to with this, with what I'm taking stock of here. Thank you.
Yeah, and thank you. I think you're definitely contributing to it. And I don't have a expansive knowledge of early modern literature or plays, but I think there are definitely benefits to seeing these parallels through the lens of history. I think they can create new ways of seeing. And you did mention only recently we're kind of seeing not only intense awareness to this, but the largest movement since the 60s to sort of address these issues. But one of the dangers in failing to cultivate those new ways of seeing is that movement, sort of like it has been, is sort of co-opted by like the Democratic Party as a whole, I think. Because you have to ask what sort of structural reparations or changes have been made since Joe Biden in a lot of ways sort of took the movement and rode the coattails of, and then we're kind of left out in the open wondering if there is structural or systemic change possible as the system currently exists. So I like these poetic historical approaches to generating new ways of seeing, because there's in many ways it's becoming more difficult to rely on the systemic changes that those movements can make now. There needs to be a new sort of new imaginary, new theory, new ways of seeing, as I was saying. So yeah, thank you very much.
I'll just briefly respond to the questions from Hunter, which were very much appreciated, and I think are particularly important in sort of the scholarship we're doing now, and kind of that question of the through lines or the connections between what seems like sort of the distant early modern period and how such sort of concepts or investigations into texts of the time do kind of persist, or are potentially sort of a link in a chain of thought that contributes to ideas that we have today. And sort of part of the larger exploration of sort of the expanded paper goes into some of what JC was covering about this hesitance in sort of the early modern period to recognize some of the racial discourse of the time and how that's sort of being dismantled and reevaluated by more current scholarship. And I do think like part of this anatomical investigation is revealing at least concepts or ideas that do seem somewhat similar today. Kind of the concept of that we'll see kind of in literature and adaptations and things today, the idea that a lot of characters are sort of assumed white unless specifically specified as not. And again, kind of that the danger of considering sort of white as a standard instead of sort of just another kind of racial category, which is current scholarships points to this need to recognize whiteness as, a racial category, and that prompts its own evaluation. It's not simply sort of the standard by which other racial categories are put to. So yeah, I think it's definitely sort of a productive line of thought to think about how these ideas manifest today.
Yeah, thank you. I was really, sort of entranced by this sort of intense focus on the body that you took. I do like a lot of psychoanalysis in my work, so I'm always sort of urging these returns to the body. And that's why I asked about this sort of idea of like anxiety at the time, because I think these notions of the body itself and its relationship to the forms of anxiety that can be produced by its conception or by the discourse that surrounds it, they greatly impact political action and the way that we act in community, right? And so I just want to say it's all very interesting to me. I hadn't thought about the skin in these ways. So thank you so much.
Okay, next we have a question from Victoria Silver.
Folks, what I'm about to say is not meant to be provocative. It's meant to be inquisitive, okay? And then this is coming out of obviously the Hobbes conference, and what Hobbes does, okay? And my concern all the time is methodological, okay? And what strikes me, all right, and I'm sure you guys have confronted this, is the problem of, first of all, you're fighting an essentialist argument, fundamentally, okay? You're fighting the claim that Black means thus and such, okay? At the same time, okay, you yourselves, okay, are treating, and this is true of Afro-pessimism as well, treating Blackness, all right, as a new standard, okay, as a standard that, all right, has been effaced, but now needs to displace, all right, the white standard, okay? And it strikes me, okay, and I'm just thinking about this in terms of the fact that you're both writing about drama, all right? And drama, as we all know, okay, does not have an editorial voice, usually, okay? What it has, okay, are conflicting voices, okay? And it does, to some extent, tend to, all right, disagree amongst itself, okay? So when Shakespeare sets up a series of characters, all right, who in varying degrees agree or disagree on the, shall we say, the valence of Blackness, okay, all right, one cannot, as it were, immediately construe that, okay, to a common argument, okay, all right? And so here's what I'm asking, okay? And then I have a follow-up question, which should just render you miserable, okay? All right. I'm asking, how do you deflect, all right, the countercharge, all right, that you guys are engaging in the new essentialism, okay? And if that is the case, okay, what is the point? I mean, is there some way, and I put it to you both, all right, that we can move away from this tendency, all right, to create a correspondence theory of truth now, all right, associated with the body, okay? Is there some way that we can, in fact, use our expressions, all right, the expressions about Blackness, okay, use our expressions, all right, differently, all right, to escape the consequences of our expressions about whiteness?
Well, thank you for that, Silver. That's actually a very useful set of questions. Not provocative at all. I mean, it is provocative, but you know what I mean. In terms of like, I guess the way it's generative to how I want to define, right, the interventions here, the stakes in both of our presentations. At least for me, the way I see, you know, Afro-pessimism, among other frameworks, is not so much advancing an idea, you know, of what it means to be Black, but rather to diagnose the way that anti-Blackness, you know, works. So my response, right, to the essentialist arguments circulated in, you know, the discourses we've been describing, the claims that Black means X, is to sort of just perform a symptomatic reading of how these essentialist arguments work, not to so much characterize Blackness as this newer standard, but to characterize the anti-Blackness that, you know, that sort of shapes and gives texture to the white standards in the first place. But yeah, like to respond to the notion of drama lacking this editorial voice, to conflicting voices being present within the text itself, I can think of, you know, that being very salient, you know, not only in, you know, Othello, but also in this other play that engages with Blackness on some level, The Tempest, right? Centralized in the figure of Caliban, who is, yeah, you can read him as this very direct sort of like figure of the colonized subject, but he's also been interpreted as a foil, right, to Prospero, kind of embodying a lot of the sort of negative aspects of Prospero's character that he himself is laboring to suppress throughout the play, or at least not address directly. And so when I go about, right, talking about these specific moments in each play, that's not to sort of like crowd out, right, these other sort of avenues of possibility for how we read Othello, but like how is nonetheless this idea of Othello, right, this construction of Blackness that he himself confronts, how is that still like something symptomatic of the play? How is that still revealed as this powerful conflicting voice with other elements of the narrative? And so, yeah, I guess all of that aforementioned represents my countercharge, right? To say that this isn't so much a new essentialism for the Black body or the Black subject, but rather a continued sort of analysis of what anti-Blackness is, right? How does that, as not just like an attitude, but an ideology with this unspoken, well, not really unspoken, but like, you know, tradition that persists since the early modern period, perhaps since before, etc. This is all to talk about like how this pattern has traveled and how it continues to do so in the ways I've addressed in a different comment. But thank you.
So yeah, similarly, I think this is a very generative question, and hopefully I can get my thoughts into a generative space and not just sort of bounce around with my ideas. The first thought I was thinking about is sort of your question about drama and your point about it not having sort of that editorial focus. And similarly to JC, I think, or I'd like to propose that this sort of anatomical reading is not meant to impose sort of a specific, impose a specific and, you know, quote, correct reading of the text, or close down other interpretations of even the exact same sort of moments and lines. I think the interesting aspect of kind of early modern literary scholarship, and particularly scholarship of drama, is particularly that point of pushing a line in any particular direction yields sort of different results. And in the case of sort of my project here was simply to kind of push a particular lens on the text and sort of see what resulted from that. And I think sort of thinking about that and kind of the concept of the push, I was again thinking about sort of modes of thought, or sort of these ideas that are generating, or conversations that are occurring in the early modern period that may have resulted in particular sort of viewing experiences of drama, not specifically something that is intended in the drama, but a reading that could occur from a particular conversation if the audience sort of were privy to that conversation, how it would impact their reception of the drama. So I think in that way it sort of resists pushing this particular sort of interpretation of the characters. And I think even going back to the reading of the anatomical texts as almost literary texts, it's not to sort of establish a new standard, but I think to, again, open up the possibility that there are these interpretations, there are these ideas that could result from a reading of these texts that then can sort of persist and proliferate and be maybe appropriated or picked up in different ways, that then result in, you know, rhetorics or different thoughts occurring sort of going forward. So the purpose of kind of the scholarship is to just put that in perspective and sort of force you to reconcile yourself to the fact that certain views and certain acceptances of, you know, what it means to be white or Black, or putting them in these sort of essentialist categories, are impacted by different rhetorics and specific readings of these texts.
Well, I
Hopefully
have to say,
that came together.
Honey, it did. No, in fact, I want to say, I mean, that's a difficult subject, and those are difficult texts, and you both wrote beautifully about the problems associated with them. And I have to especially commend your answers right now, all right, which seem to me to be absolutely right, okay? And I'll hold off on my other question, okay, so that Deanna gets a chance, as it were.
I'm happy if we can come back to you, Vicki. So first of all, I'm never going to read about blood in the same way. Having heard your paper, Chelsea, it was just really interesting. And both of you just raised so many important questions. I'm going to talk about a couple of things that each of you said, and I hope I haven't mangled your words. So if I have, you'll readjust, I hope. But I was thinking about, JC, you know, when you said, you referred to Blackness as a threat to a unified English vision of the world, something like that, I think. And Chelsea, at one point in your paper, you talked about universal whiteness as being connected to Christian uniformity. And so I'm thinking about unity and uniformity in the frameworks that you're dealing with. And you made me think back also to texts from my world in Italian studies. And I was thinking really about the chivalric epics of the period, many of which have to do with the Crusades and Christian attitudes toward Islam, toward Moors, toward paganism, etc. In Tasso's famous Jerusalem Delivered, we have one such situation of a crusade. And one of the really important readings of the last generation of that text has talked about the problem of uniform Christianity against multiform paganism. I think that's what it is. I'm translating. So you made me, both of your papers made me start to think about the problem of accepting plurality. Within this racial framework that you're working with, or that you're trying to dismantle, managing the sort of epistemic and political anxieties that come with pluralism or plurality, whether it's plural racial identities, plural religious identities, or, to go back to Hobbes, a kind of plurality within the political populace. And so I'm wondering, if you have anything to say about the potential usefulness of dealing with this question by shifting away from a binary to a multiplicity, let's just say.
I can sort of jump in with sort of my initial thoughts, and I think it's a very interesting question. And you're pointing sort of to the moment in the text or my paper discussing the Christian uniformity. And I was seeing it as pulling out of these anatomical texts who often have, in this English sense, sections dedicated to anatomy's ability to sort of like reinforce faith in God, coincide with Christian teachings. And specifically, the text Microcosmographia is talking about, the description of man as sort of a microcosm of the divine, in a sense, and that to know the human body is to know more about God. And therefore, kind of that brings up the question, if man is image of God, then which man is the right image? And that sort of leads to the sort of conflicts that such an idea can produce. But I think there's something interesting in the concept of, instead of making it a binary between sort of two separate things, that sort of in a multiplicity, you can in some way sort of coalesce into a more ambiguous representation of, a body that is divine or sort of somewhat connected to a more divine image. And therefore, like in the plurality, you get more room for difference while still maintaining the cohesion, or it's sort of like the universality that you want to reinforce those perspectives.
That's super interesting. Thank you. And I'm also thinking now, something that I've failed to say earlier is that we also have this, in this period, we have a plurality within Christianity too. We have the conflict of the Reformation, the Counter-Reformation, and in fact, Tasso's text is a resolutely Counter-Reformation text, and Hobbes, of course, in the context of our larger conversation, is dealing with the horizon of political war, so of religious war.
Yeah, thank you for the comments, Deanna, and the questions. And I think to sort of loosely follow the thread Chelsea provided, right, about binary and pluralities, I definitely think there's this tendency I've noticed when there's an emerging plurality, right? How do adherents to notions of a binary try to negotiate, mediate, or sublimate that, right? I think that was present in what I was saying about how Abdelmelek is construed in the Battle of Alcazar, right? He's a Moor, but he's not black the way Mullah Muhammad is. And yet Moorishness, right, is held as synonymous with blackness in some discourses and not others. And in terms of that, right, the sort of anxiety generated by a pluralist view, I think, is under like constant threat of being rendered, binary by a given sort of hegemonic presence. I think that sort of negotiation was probably happening in what was fighting to be considered a predominant or dominant notion, right, of Christianity or group of Christians. And even, in a sort of pluralistic world, this is going to diverge from a lot of these discourses, but during the American occupation of the Philippines, there was this binary being imposed, right, of whiteness versus blackness. And it was in the ways that American officials were indoctrinating Filipinos into idolizing what it meant to be white and American, and at the same time cultivating this sort of denigration of darker skin, such that during, I think even to this day, skin whitening cream is a popular product among Filipinos. And, that sort of symptom of colonial mentality is, and colonial mentality, I think, in general, is a product of this conflict between the imposition of a binary, right, of white versus black, when faced with pluralistic populations, including, right, shades of skin color, non-black, people of color, etc. So there's definitely elasticity to all of the notions you've raised. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Okay, now we have a question from Keith.
First of all, thank you to both Chelsea and JC for really excellent papers. Really enjoyed both of them. Chelsea, I have a really quick question. In your talk, and then I think you repeated this again during one of your responses, you mentioned the presumption, I believe this was specifically with regard to your discussion of the anatomical texts, that quote whiteness, the presumption that the skin is white unless otherwise specified. And I'm wondering about this sort of unless otherwise specified part of that phrase, right? Because there are sort of currents of textual interpretation, which are grounded in the idea that oftentimes the most interesting and revealing aspects of the text can be identified precisely at those moments when the sort of official line is qualified, or one finds exceptions. One is forced to actually sort of state explicitly what are oftentimes assumed implicitly. And so I'm wondering, in your reading of these texts, when you do find those moments where it's otherwise specified, if there's anything sort of interesting that we can learn by looking carefully at those passages.
Yeah, so in my reading of the text and kind of getting a survey for the texts, it always kind of followed very similar trajectories, and it usually sort of opened up in the discussion of kind of the defining of the epidermis as the scarf skin, and kind of its descriptions and its relation to the true skin underneath. In many cases, this understanding of the skin would then be kind of qualified by an additional example, or specifically a noted Black figure would be brought into the texts and outlined to kind of reinforce the whiteness of the true skin. So we kind of have the moment where it's saying sort of, in this example, we understand and we know that like this underskin is white because we can see it in distinction in this specific Black figure, where underneath the Black skin, there's this white skin. And otherwise, we have instances where specifically a Black figure, it's sort of brought into discussion and said something along the lines of the Blackness goes no lower than this coat, talking about kind of the outward skin. And so it's kind of those moments in which specifically the text kind of has to arrest itself and make a comment on, we know that this skin underneath, sort of what we understand as the dermis, now we understand that is white, and we know that because we have evidence of these Black figures where there's that contrast between the epidermis and the dermis. And those are really the only moments where distinctions in skin color really come to the fore. And therefore it's kind of, the implications there are the bodies we've been observing, this definition or this exploration, this anatomizing of the skin has been in this white figure, and then the Black figure is only specifically sort of invoked in order to essentially reinforce the image that they've already produced of the body. So I find that kind of interesting in terms of that concept of it's assumed a whiteness until the alternative is brought up as specifically that, an alternative.
Okay, Jane Lewis.
Hi, I know it's getting late. I just a thought came to me, partly inspired by the most recent two questions. And thank you both for these presentations. I work in a slightly later period, so I'm kind of off my turf. But I wanted to kind of maybe try to relate what both of you are doing to the conference again. And what you both made me wonder is what color Hobbes's sovereign is. You know, I kept thinking back, I know I mentioned the frontispiece earlier and a couple of other points in the weekend, but I keep coming back to that, and also the point that Vicky was making about, you know, sort of organizing plurality within a single image. I was thinking about, you know, that image and the extent to which the bodies that constitute Hobbes's sovereign are, for one thing, they're clothed, which I find really, really fascinating. And Chelsea, I'd be really curious to know what you do with dress and the fact of dress, not so much the metaphor of the coat, but, you know, how that actually, you know, comports with some of the other things that you're thinking about skin. But just for both of you, a really broad question, obviously understanding that you're talking about the earlier period, but is it possible, and I guess this also, by the way, turns on the question of, you know, whether it's ever possible to solve a problem from within the situation in which it was created. Is it possible to imagine a Black sovereign in the context that you both are thinking about? So those are my questions. I just thought possibly useful in terms of bringing things together with, you know, the sort of presiding voice of the conference. So I don't know if you have thoughts on those or not. Very interesting presentations. So thank you both.
Thank you, Jane. The broad question, you know, I think is actually quite powerful in the sense that, like, I'm flattered to hear it, but also I'm like, how do I even go about answering this question, right? Like, on the one hand, yeah, thank you. Like, on the one hand, to imagine, I think, a Black sovereign in these contexts would have to demand, like, I think, I don't know, being able to think of beyond these contexts as well, right? Like, to sort of echo what you were saying, like, how can we solve a problem that is constrained by the very same situation that created it? How can we construe a Black sovereign in a discourse community or an environment, right? Or dare I say, a paradigm that privileges what is undoubtedly a white sovereign? Is sovereignty itself, can that even be imagined as something that you can rightfully, you know, and unambiguously attribute to a Black person or even a non-Black person of color? Like, or does, like, I guess it depends on the parlance of sovereign and what form it really takes, right? I don't know. I also don't know if a Black sovereign under these constraints and conditions would, you know, be something that is desirable, right? Ethically even. And I don't know if that's something that critical race theory, right, or Afro-pessimism or critical Black studies scholarship receiving the early modern period, and perhaps any that may engage with Hobbes, like I don't know if they would want to gesture towards that either. But this is also slightly escaping my own wheelhouse. But thank you.
No, it's not. That's a really great question. And it really does, I think, beg the question, is Hobbes sovereign implicitly white, and the fact that the bodies that constitute him are Black and are dressed and have their backs to us, so we can't actually see. But anyway, that's a great answer. Sorry.
Thank you, Jane.
Yeah, I can jump in quickly. I know we're ending. Just thinking about the concept of clothing in that question is also interesting in the anatomical texts. Not in this presentation, but some texts do again refer to that scarf skin as an unseamed garment. And there's this, this connection between kind of like that outer skin as being pretty much clothing, and how that can complicate, what is represented and what do we think of, the potentially of it being, cast off. And I think we see in JC's presentation, things that happened, with skinning and things like that, which make the concept of skin as an unseamed garment very interesting. And also, again, the drama of the time and the representations of race often being done through fabric can further kind of complicate that notion, and how it can, again, contribute to the plural that contributes to kind of the Leviathan, and again, the distinction between sort of what contributes to the representation. Is it sort of the garment, or is there something inherent that kind of goes into it that complicates sort of the image?
Yeah, that's really, you make me think about Black labor too, producing new textile, the materials of new textiles in the colonies. So that's really cool. Thank you both for speculating on a vague question. Thanks.
Okay, and then we'll finish off with Victoria's question.
This is a question, happily, that we can all walk away with, all right? That I see that Owen and Joseph are there, maybe Peter, all right, but obviously JC and Chelsea. And that is, can we talk to each other across our disciplines? All right. To some extent, I would say to both Joseph and Owen, okay, all right, there are aspects clearly, all right, of Hobbes' representation, all right, of a commonwealth, okay, which are deeply troubled, all right, by what JC and Chelsea, all right, I won't say unearth, but I will, all right, in, a Shakespearean play, all right, and non-Shakespearean plays, okay. Is there, in fact, I mean, probably for both Joseph and Owen, what can, all right, Hobbes say, all right, to this problem, okay, all right? Can we, in fact, find a ground for discussion, okay? And, and vice versa, all right? What can JC and Chelsea, who are neither of them Hobbists, if I may say so, all right, which by the way is derogatory, okay, all right, can they say, all right, to the kinds of concerns, all right, that Joseph, Owen, and Peter, if he's there, all right, discuss? Because when Keith and I put this whole conference together, the whole idea was, all right, it's an interdisciplinarity, okay? What are the possibilities on a common topic, all right, of revealing, all right, indeed, obvious distinctions, you could bet on that, but commonalities, okay? And that's my question.
That's a really great question, and I'd love to open it up to the audience, but I'm very conscious of the time.
Exactly. No, Holly, forget it. I'm just putting it out there.
I think the answer is the conference. So,
that's good, Deanna.
A great rounding off question, Vicky.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. Yeah, a great note to end on. Yeah, thank you to our panelists for their great presentations, and to our discussants for some really insightful and thought-provoking feedback. Thank you also to Keith and Victoria and Deanna for making this possible and for organizing it, and to Ryan for his incredible amount of help along the way. It's been really, really appreciated. And thank you to everyone who's joined us today, especially with it being a Saturday. Yeah, it's been great to have so many of you here.